The young lady looked intently out the window. She was shocked that she had not noticed the obvious before. Real, her dear sister betrayed her, kissing her fiancé as if she was waiting for a reaction. She glanced slyly towards her sister and deliberately mocked her. If you think about it like that, the young man had already started acting strange a long time ago. For example, recently he allegedly accidentally left the room with a young lady. The young man often came secretly to take a walk with Real. Also, all the maids knew about this and were not even ashamed to discuss their relationship. She was in shock because of everything that was happening, because she couldn't believe the betrayal of her family. The young lady understood that she did not want to admit the obvious at all and avoided the harsh reality. But she knew that this was happening not only now in relation to her fiancé, whom her sister decided to take away. From an early age, their birthdays were always held on the same day for Real's convenience. Because her younger sister was born with poor health, everyone began to revolve around her, to such an extent that the young lady considered herself superfluous in their family. The young lady was very hurt and sad that she was constantly avoided and not noticed. Parents defined love more for their youngest daughter. But the young lady was able to realize this only on her 11th birthday. The little girl came closer to her mother and called her. The young girl sincerely wanted to tell her mother something. But Riel called her mom and dad because she wanted to quickly blow out the candles and make a wish. The woman looked at her daughter Irene and said that if she had something important to say, they should talk a little later. Irene was surprised and upset because she wanted to tell her mother something. The woman looked at her daughter and said that she was actually an older sister, and therefore she should moderate her ardor and give her younger sister a holiday. Irene looked down in disappointment and agreed with her mother. As a result, their birthday began only for Riel. Irene was wondering what wish her sister made, since she just wanted to thank her mother for giving her life. The parents congratulated their youngest daughter and gave her gifts. She was very happy in turn. Riel looked at her sister with contempt. She was very glad that she was being paid more attention. Irene was a little surprised and angry as her sister stared at her and smirked. In the middle of the holiday, Riel fell ill. Her parents were shocked as they did not expect such a turn of events. In a hurry, they rushed to their youngest daughter. The father was furious and shouted to quickly call a doctor so that he could come to them immediately. After such a birthday, Irene began to move more and more away from her family. Parents, in turn, paid more attention to their youngest daughter, who was in poor health. 6 years later, Irene entered the Imperial Academy, a year later, so that even there she could take care of her beloved sister. She wanted to believe that everything was fine. At the academy, she made friends. One of the young ladies lent Irene her notes. The girl knew that it was still difficult for Irene because she also had to take care of her sick sister, which is why she often missed classes. Irene was very happy and thanked the young lady, and she also said that she would now be in her debt. The girls smiled because they knew that they were friends and there was nothing complicated about it, because they were sure that they needed to help each other. Irene was very happy as she was able to find her first friends. Her younger sister closely watched everything that happened. Riel wanted to get rid of her sister's new friends. For some reason, the day after they met, the young ladies began to avoid Irene. Real of this, but she only smiled innocently. Riel said that those ladies must have initially not really wanted to be friends with Irene. Riel said that she thought it was even better because she only had to take care of her sister, and besides, their mother was worried that playing friends would cause Irene to leave Riel all alone. Riel said that of course she immediately stood up for Irene in front of her mother, and said that she was a very good sister and daughter who would never do something like that. Irene was completely sure that it was her sister who set her friends up, and they stopped communicating. It was Irene's duty to tolerate Riel due to the fact that she was born healthy, and she had to give up happiness in favor of Riel. And even after graduating from the academy, the family mansion became nothing more than a prison for Irene, in which she was her sister's personal servant. But one day, she met one young man at a banquet which she attended on behalf of her parents. The young man greeted the young lady and introduced himself. The young man's name was Boris Gurton. Irene, in turn, also introduced herself and said that it was a great honor for her to meet the young man. He knew very well what had happened to Irene since childhood, so he tried to support her with all his might. Boris was always by her side when she was sad or lonely. The young man looked softly and intently at his companion and asked if she would marry him. She knew that if she married Boris, she would be able to leave home and stop being Real's puppet. Irene agreed that the young man's family was on the verge of extinction. He was in a great hurry to prepare for the engagement, and as soon as the engagement celebration was over, he came closer to her because he wanted to get her body. Irene was a little shocked by everything that was happening. She pushed him away and said she wasn't ready yet. He looked at her and said with a grin that in this case nothing could be done. Smiling, he agreed with her refusal and said that in that case they would do everything later. When Irene saw her fiancé and sister spending time together, she was shocked. The young man looked at his future bride and said that it was just a misunderstanding, and she understood everything wrong. Irene was shocked as she realized that this was the result of her turning him down. Riel looked at her sister and agreed with Boris. She said that her sister just misunderstood everything. Irene was shocked by such impudence and lies from people close to her. She looked at them and asked why then they spend all their time together and arrange secret meetings. Before she could answer anything, Riel fell. Boris was shocked because he noticed that Riel felt bad. He was at a loss and wanted to help her immediately. Riel glared at her sister and said that Irene knew her better than anyone, and she would never do that to her own sister. Irene was shocked because her sister said similar words after staring into her eyes while kissing her fiancé. Irene looked at her sister and asked her to stop talking like that, and she also told Riel not to dare to call her sister anymore. Irene told her sister that from now on she was no one to her anymore. Boris was shocked. He shouted to his bride that she was too cruel. Irene looked at Boris with contempt and told him to leave her house, since a man like him is not worthy to be called her fiancé. Irene took the ring off her finger and threw it on the ground. Irene knew that from now on she would live only for herself. Irene knew that from now on she would live only for herself after such a betrayal from her family. She didn't want to see them around her anymore. Erin looked at the butler and called him. She told the butler to order the servants to carry her luggage to the room on the 3rd floor. The butler was shocked and did not understand why there was such a rush. He was at a loss and asked if Lady Riel needed to change rooms. The butler said that the old room needed airing, because the smell of medicine is persistent. The butler said that they always move in together and also asked what happened this time. Irene knew that the butler was used to her always moving with Riel, but this time, everything was different. Irene looked at him and said that she was moving alone and that he should tell the servants to move her luggage, and Riel, in turn, will remain on the 2nd floor. The butler was shocked by the young lady's words. He asked her if she shouldn't discuss this decision with her mother. Irene said that she was no longer 7 years old and did not need her mother's permission. Irene looked at the maid and told her to tell the servants to have time to move all her luggage by mid-morning. The maid obediently agreed. Irene was glad that she could finally move out, since Riel would no longer be sitting in the next room, and Irene would finally be able to enjoy being alone. She looked intently at the bundles of paper. Irene saw something interesting. Erin suddenly heard someone knocking on the door while she was looking at the packages. Her mother stormed into the room and angrily slapped her daughter in the face. Irene was shocked by her mother's behavior, as she did not expect this. Her mother, in turn, shouted at her daughter, as she was very angry with her behavior. Irene's mother was furious because she said Irene's fiancé told her everything. Her mother was furious as Riel fainted because of Irene. She screamed at her daughter in rage because Riel could have died because of Irene's behavior. Irene did not listen to her mother's reproaches and angrily came closer to her and asked what her fault was. She said it was not her fault that Riel was born with poor health. Her mother was shocked and said that Riel was her sister, and she was responsible for her. Erin was shocked and asked why others were not responsible for her. She asked if she was not also a member of the family, and she also asked why she had to sacrifice everything for her sister. She didn't know if there was justice for her in this world. Irene didn't understand why she should be responsible for her sister. She asked her mother why no one else could watch her. Parental love, favorite hobby, friends, and even the groom. Riel took everything she could from Irene, and in the end, Irene is bad. The mother sighed heavily and said that Irene was right. She asked her daughter for forgiveness and said that she only now realized how difficult it had been for Irene all this time. She said she didn't know how Irene was suffering all this time. Irene was pleasantly surprised and hoped that her mother understood her. She said that she apologized and tried to understand her daughter. And she also asked if Irene could go to Riel now, since Riel was very lonely, and she was worried that she was getting sick while they were talking about such topics. Irene was shocked as she sincerely hoped for understanding and love from her mother. But her hope was dashed by cruel reality. Irene looked at her mother and said that she would go see Riel later. Closing the doors in front of her mother, she asked her to leave. Her mother was a little puzzled, as she did not expect this from her daughter. Irene couldn't stand it and burst into tears outside the door, as it was very difficult for her. She was upset, and yet she wondered what she even expected since everything was obvious. She made sure after her mother's words that Riel's comfort was a priority in their home. For example, when they both felt bad, all attention was focused on their beloved daughter. Irene was always forced to take care of her sister, regardless of her health condition. Deep down, Irene always knew the truth. Irene considered herself stupid because she continued to believe that she would one day be loved. She knew she shouldn't have done this, but she really wanted to have a loving family. After all her experiences, she noticed that night had already fallen. Irene decided to immediately arrange her things and drawings. She got carried away and noticed late that Riel fainted. Because of this, she had to give up drawing. She didn't know if the family should make such sacrifices. The young lady did not know whether they considered her a member of the family. She frantically wanted to get out of her home as quickly as possible. The young lady didn't know how to do it right. She knew Chase County had powerful connections, but if she runs away, she will be pursued. Irene knew that she needed to find a way in which she could legally leave her family and leave home without persecution. She knew that if she thought about it that way, the only way to get rid of the shackles of her family was to get married. The young man, looking at the picture, said that his grandfather still had stupid conditions. The young man was perplexed. He looked at his master and asked what he thought he was doing next. He also asked if the master could ask everyone in the area. The young master thought about his servant's words. A moment later, he looked at his servant and said that in that case, I also need to collect more information. Noel Kristen was born a bastard after the Duke had an affair with a commoner. Accordingly, the next Archduke was to become his legitimate elder brother, and as soon as his father left the world due to illness, following him, his older brother died and fell from a horse, which is why Noel became the only heir of the family. Grandfather, who never wanted to recognize Noel, put forward conditions for him under which he would never be able to become the head of the family. Noel sat puzzled and thought about marriage. He did not know who would even want to marry him. Irene, walking along the corridor, heard laughter. She knew that she needed to pull herself together in order to appear before everyone in all her glory. Irene entered the hall where her relatives were having a meal. Irene looked at them and apologized for being late. She was always afraid of their evil faces, so she used to come with Riel. But she no longer cared about their attitude towards her, and she no longer needed their love. The young lady looked at her sister and said that she fainted yesterday. A moment later, Riel said that Irene probably didn't have the strength to apologize for this incident yesterday, so Riel said that Irene could do it now. Irene looked at her sister and asked why she should apologize to her. Irene looked at her sister and said that she should be the one apologizing. She also asked her to stop playing the victim. The parents were shocked and could not understand how Irene dared to talk to her sister like that. Irene looked at her mother and father and asked how else she could talk to the man who kissed her fiancé. Riel was shocked by what her sister said. She didn't know how to respond to her sister's words. The father was shocked and furiously asked Riel if this was true. Riel was shocked and didn't know what to answer. Riel fell to the floor and begged for forgiveness in tears. She also said that she was just jealous of her sister. Riel said that she was in poor health and was unlikely to meet a man who would want to marry her, and for the young men she was just an invalid who would be a burden to them. The parents were shocked by their daughter's words. Riel said that when Boris turned his attention to her. She was so happy that she didn't even have time to come to her senses. The parents rushed to Riel. The father said that they understood everything and asked his daughter to quickly get up from the cold floor. The mother in turn shouted for the servants to bring a blanket. Irene was shocked because she realized that her sister had gotten away with it again. Irene did not want to tolerate their presence any longer and decided to leave. Irene immediately left her family because she was in great pain. Irene knew that in this place no one would take care of her, and she needed to do everything herself. Her parents, in turn, reassured Riel. Irene sincerely did not want to see her family anymore. Irene knew she needed to take action immediately. She looked at the maid and asked if there was an invitation for today's date. The maid said that she first needed to deal with Madame Riel's order. Irene was puzzled, and looking at her maid, she asked if she was her maid, and also asked if it was her duty to carry out Irene's orders. She knew that there was no way she could allow the servants to disparage her. Irene looked at the maid and told her to immediately bring all the letters that were sent today. Walking down the corridor, Irene said that she needed to change her outfit. Irene reviewed all the proposals and invitations to tea parties, birthdays, and balls. She decided that from now on she would stop sitting at home and start attending all the celebrations. Most of the invitations were rejected due to her babysitting for Riel, and she did not even get to make her debut in high society. She knew that today there would be a ball at the residence of the Jasmine Duchy. Irene thought that she should go there after all. The maid looked at her mistress and said that she had brought a dress. She took everything she had, and therefore did not know what would suit her. Irene politely thanked the maid. The maid smiled and said that there was nothing to thank her for. Irene chose one dress that she really liked. A moment later, the maid began getting ready for her mistress. Irene saw that her look was unobtrusive, but at the same time fashionable. The color itself perfectly matched her green eyes and brown hair. She was surprised and didn't know if it was true. She couldn't even imagine that she could be as beautiful as her sister. The maid looked at her mistress and said that she looked so beautiful. Irene smiled and thanked the maid for her lovely words. Irene knew that this is what the maid collected real, and she turned out to have very good taste. Aaron knew that it was not in vain that she chose her. Irene told the maid to immediately prepare the carriage. A moment later, Irene walked leisurely towards the carriage. Riel saw that Irene was going to go to the ball and was very surprised. Riel looked at her sister and said that she was very beautiful today, and she also asked where she was going to go. Irene looked at her sister and said that she was going to the ball. Riel was puzzled, since her sister had never visited such places, and she did not understand why she now decided to go to the ball. Irene looked at her sister and said that everything was true, since she took care of her all the time, but this would not happen again. Riel wanted to say something else to her sister, but her father pulled her hand and asked her to calm down. And he also said that she needed to go inside, as he knew about her health condition. Riel looked at her father and said that she also wanted to go to the ball. Riel said this was her sister's first time attending such an event, so she needs her support. The father looked at his daughter and said that the doctor said that Riel should not overexert herself. Irene looked at her sister with contempt and said that she didn't need her there. Riel was shocked by her sister's answer. She didn't expect this. Riel knew that she could not forgive her sister for such free behavior. Irene was a little puzzled, but she was also very glad that for the first time she did not indulge her sister. Irene knew that if she got out of this house, she could live freely. Irene knew that it was time for her to make new acquaintances. She wanted to sincerely find out everything about life outside the home. She was introduced as befits a young lady, and Irene slowly walked around the hall. She heard everyone whispering furiously behind her back. The young ladies said that there were a lot of rumors about Irene, and they didn't think she would come, and they also discussed her choice of clothing. Irene was very nervous. But I decided to pull myself together because I hoped that everything would be fine. Irene walked near the young ladies. One of the young ladies was surprised that Irene came to such an event, since such a thing was rare. The young lady looked at Irene and said that she was honored to have her here, as thanks to her coming, the young lady's ball would be on everyone's lips. Jessie Jasmine looked at Irene and said that she was honored to meet her. She said that she was the organizer of today's ball. Irene, in turn, thanked the young lady and also introduced herself. Irene looked at the young lady and asked why the ball would be on everyone's lips because of her. Jessie looked at her and said with a smile that Irene had never appeared anywhere before. So a rumor spread that supposedly no matter where she would not go. Jessie said that since Irene attended her ball, it means it was well organized, and she was very pleased. Jessie looked at Irene and asked if she would like to join them. Irene knew that if the young lady was the organizer, then through her Irene would be able to learn a lot about high society. She looked at the young girl especially and said that she would be glad to join them. Jessie smiled as she introduced Irene to the young ladies. One of the young ladies said that she had heard a lot about Irene, adding that they needed to sit down quickly. One of the young ladies looked at Irene and said that Chase County was a family of the greatest merit. She asked if the Count was feeling well. Irene replied with a smile that he was fine. Irene was amazed because she had just come out and everyone had already started talking about family. She didn't know if everyone communicated like that in high society. The young ladies were discussing a rumor that Archduke Kristen himself was to come to the ball. One young lady said that he seemed to be looking for a bride. Irene was very surprised. The young lady said that she also heard that he needed to marry a lady that his grandfather would approve of, and if he does not do this, he will not be able to inherit the title of Archduke. The young lady laughed because she didn't understand who would want to marry a bastard and endure bullying. The hostess of the banquet laughed and said that if the Archduke had not been a bastard, he would have been the most eligible bachelor. Erin was a little surprised, since everyone seemed to be only interested in the person's origins. While she lived in Riel's shadow as her nanny, she wondered what bad things were said about her behind her back. Irene heard the young ladies mention that the Archduke needed to get married in order to inherit the family title. She thought for a moment. While the young ladies were talking, the waltz began. The young lady looked at Irene and asked if she would like to dance. Irene smiled and said that she would probably refuse for now. The young ladies noticed that the Archduke had appeared in the crowd. Everyone present at the ball saw such an unpleasant picture. Irene saw the Archduke for the first time. She was surprised, because I imagined him differently. Irene and everyone present looked intently at the Archduke. The young and tipsy youth shouted at the Archduke and hurled unpleasant insults in his direction. He looked at him with contempt and asked if he was the next Archduke. Irene knew that the young man had come simply to find a bride, and I decided not to waste my chance. Looking at everyone present, Irene noticed that there was vile laughter everywhere. She thought that, most likely, she was not at a ball, but in some kind of zoo. Noel looked at the young man and asked for forgiveness if something did not suit him. The young man screamed at Noel in rage. He furiously wanted him to fall to his knees in front of him. Irene was shocked by this behavior of the impudent young man. Noel was surprised and very angry. He looked at the drunken young man with contempt and said that he was busy now, and also asked if he could leave him alone. The young man noticed Noel's cold and angry gaze, after which he became frantically frightened. The young man hesitated as Noel fixed him with a cold gaze. Noel could not tolerate the presence of the young man and decided to immediately leave his company. Irene gazed after the young man. One of the young ladies said that she was very bored because she expected them to fight. Everyone around them laughed and said that they were very sorry that Noel could not amuse them. Irene was shocked, because for the young people who were present at such an event, such a spectacle was just fun. Irene was shocked, as she was disgusted to listen to such conversations. She wanted to quickly leave this place and no longer be near them. Irene looked at the young ladies who were next to her and said that she was not feeling well. Irene knew that the Archduke, being a bastard, was hated by me only in society and also in his family. She knew that no one even wanted to help him. After all, everyone cares only about themselves. She thought they were very similar. Irene sat and thought about whether he could help her if she helped him. A letter of termination of the engagement sent to her fiancé was not accepted. She knew it would be difficult to find an intermediary to sell her drawings. If they get married, Noel will inherit the title. Irene, in turn, will be able to leave the hated house. She thought he would be glad that she didn't need his love. Erin knew that soon she would never need her love. Irene knew it would be very difficult, but she still desperately wanted to try, since she simply had no choice. The young lady looked around the area because she did not know where the young man had gone. A moment later, she was still able to find him. Noel heard an incomprehensible noise. He saw Irene. She was a little puzzled. He looked at her questioningly. Irene was confused because she didn't even know what she needed to say or how to start a conversation. Noel looked intently at his companion. A moment later, he asked for her forgiveness and said that he would leave for her convenience. Irene looked at him and asked him not to go anywhere. Irene took the young man's hand and said that she really wanted to help him. The young man was surprised because he did not expect this, after everything that happened at the event. The young man looked at his companion and said that first, she would let go of his hand, since he was not going to run away anywhere. Irene asked for forgiveness in a trembling voice for her rudeness. She looked at him timidly and told him to trust her as she could help him. She looked at him and said that today she heard a rumor about him. The young man lowered his eyes and sighed heavily. He looked at her and asked what she wanted to say. Irene said that as far as she knew, he could not inherit the title unless he married a girl approved by his grandfather. The young man was puzzled. As rumors spread at the speed of light, he knew that this was the work of his grandfather. Irene was a little puzzled, as she noticed that the situation was quite tense. She knew that she had to overcome herself. She looked at him and said that she was generally in a similar position. but she just needs someone to help her escape from home. The young man was surprised, because he did not expect that the young lady would want to run away from home. The whole situation was strange to him. Irene said that it was true, but marrying her would not be so easy. She knew what difficulties they would have to go through. Noel looked at her and asked her to get closer to the point. Irene said she was looking for a marriage partner. It was difficult for her, but she knew that she had no other choice. Noel was surprised by her statement and asked her if she wanted to marry him. Irene looked at him and said that he understood everything correctly. Noel said that if she was going to take over the Archduke's wealth, she might as well forget about it. Irene sighed heavily and said that she did not need wealth. She sincerely wanted to just run away from home, and nothing else bothered her. Noel came closer to her and said that if she wanted to get his heart, then she might as well forget about it. Irene pulled away from him and said that she didn't need love either. A little later, she said that she had no desire at all to take possession of wealth or, on the contrary, his heart. The young man was surprised by this statement. He didn't expect this, because he knew that other girls were only hunting for wealth. She looked at him and said she just wanted marriage, that's all. Irene already tried to marry for love, but she was betrayed. She didn't want to step on the same rake. She wanted to get her way and just run away. Irene didn't want to experience the same pain anymore. She looked at him and said that they could help each other. She hoped that he could understand her and help her. Irene was riding home in a carriage. She was very ashamed of her action. The young lady considered herself simply crazy because she realized that she had told him a lot of unnecessary things. She was embarrassed, but at the same time, she was glad that she met him. She didn't know if she would be able to marry him, but unfortunately, she had no other choice. On the way, she looked intently out the window and thought about him all the time, and about what happened. The young man looked intently at his companion and did not understand whether she was lying or not. He didn't understand her motives, and he didn't understand what she really wanted. He looked at her and said that they could help each other through marriage. Noel looked at her and asked how he could trust Irene. Irene was a little puzzled. She didn't understand what he was talking about. He looked at her and asked for forgiveness if he had offended her. The young man said that at the moment he has quite a lot of ill-wishers. Noel said that given all the circumstances, he couldn't just trust her. He didn't know if she was the enemy or not. He looked at her and asked if she would doubt it if she were in his place. Noel stared at the young lady. He thought that she could have been sent to him, and this was quite a common thing. He stared at her and noticed that she didn't wear makeup often, judging by her sloppy lipstick. He noticed that the dress was large in size. He felt as if she hadn't worn them at all. The young lady looked at her companion and said that she is the eldest daughter of the Chase family and graduated from the Imperial Academy. She is not an enemy or a joke. Irene said he could check the information if he didn't trust it. The young man looked at her, puzzled. He was very surprised because he did not expect this. Noel, after a short silence, asked her why she wanted a wedding. Irene looked at him and said that she just wanted to stop suffering and a wedding was her only way out. Noel was surprised by such a statement because after her words he realized that they were similar. The young man looked at his companion and asked for forgiveness, since he already had to go. Noel slowly left his companion. Irene shouted after him to wait. Irene wanted to talk to him a little more. Irene realized that the young man simply ignored her. She was very offended as she tried hard. She knew that she could only wait for his answer. When she was riding in the carriage, she thought that most likely she was just upset early because he didn't say anything but simply remained silent. Irene asked the coachman to stop the carriage. She really wanted to make a short stop. The young lady has arrived at her destination. She knew that if she could sell her drawings, she could make a living from it. But if she doesn't succeed, she will find another way. Entering the store, she was greeted politely, and the young man also asked what she was looking for. Because I thought she was a buyer. Irene said she wasn't going to buy anything. She looked at the young man and asked him how much this drawing would cost. The young man looked intently at the drawing. He didn't expect to see something like this. Irene really hoped that she would be able to sell the drawing, since it meant a lot to her. She hid when she painted it so as not to anger her father. The young man was surprised and amazed by the beauty of the drawing. He looked at Irene and said that the work was really beautiful, and she was able to convey the entire landscape in detail, and he also said that he really liked the floral scheme. The young lady was surprised by such excellent words. The young man looked at Irene and said that the person who painted this picture has a gentle and kind nature. He said that every detail was carefully drawn, as if their whole soul was poured into it. The young man said that he could give her 12 gold pieces for the painting, and also said that she could come to the gallery, since he would be very glad to see her. The young lady knew that it would be difficult to earn money at first, but she was very glad that she was able to earn her first money from the sale of her drawing. As she walked home, she hoped she wouldn't run into anyone. Otherwise, the questions would have started. She hoped that everyone was already asleep. Irene was very tired after such a busy day. She hoped to quickly get to her room and go to bed. I went up to my room. Irene heard Riel's voice. She was shocked that her sister was not sleeping. Irene did not expect such a meeting. Riel looked at her sister and asked if she had just returned. The young servant was telling his master about Irene Chase. Earl Chase's eldest daughter lived with her aunt until she was 3 years old. Why not with my parents is unknown. At the age of 17, she entered the Imperial Academy, and at 21, she successfully completed it. Noel noticed that Irene entered the academy a year late. He looked at his servant and asked if there was some reason. The servant said that he was not entirely sure, but in order to continue caring for his younger sister, Riel Chase, he decided to enroll 1 year later. Noel was surprised by this fact. The young man looked at Noel and said that finding information about Irene was a little more difficult than he expected. He said that he tried to ask more about her at the academy, but all the students' moods dropped when they heard her name, and this seemed very strange to him. He said that it was not possible to find out information about them, and the young man also asked whether it was worth sending a servant to the county. Noel was surprised because he expected there to be a lot of information. He looked at his companion and said that it did not matter, since he himself would go to the county when he sent the letter to the young lady. The young man looked at his master, puzzled. Noel looked sideways at the servant and asked what else there was. The young man said that Noel had previously replied that he might find a bride at the ball. He looked at his master and asked if he understood correctly that this was Irene, so he wanted to know more about her. Noel looked at the picture intently and did not answer his companion. The young man looked puzzled at his master and said that he understood him. Leafing through the book, Noel remembered the young lady. He was surprised by their first meeting and her proposal. Riel looked at her sister and said that she was very worried about her. So I decided to wait for her arrival. Riel moved closer to her sister. Riel looked at Irene and said that she was sure that the guys were lining up at the ball to meet her. She was jealous of her and wanted Irene to always be there instead of going to events. Irene decided not to communicate with her sister and said that she was very tired and wanted to sleep. Riel was shocked. She looked at her sister and took her hand. She said that she has changed a lot lately. Riel looked at Irene and asked if she was still angry about the situation with Boris. Riel said that she only wanted to keep Irene safe by revealing his true identity. She didn't understand how it was possible to be offended by this, since she believed that her sister should, on the contrary, thank her. Irene looked at her sister and asked her to be quiet. Irene did not want to continue the unnecessary conversation with her sister. Riel looked at her sister and said that it really hurt her to see that Irene was avoiding her. Riel said her health has deteriorated recently. Irene looked at her sister with contempt and asked her not to manipulate her. Riel was very surprised by her sister's statement. Irene said that Riel no longer has the right to invade her privacy, even if Boris is a weak-minded womanizer. Riel was just making a disgusting excuse for seducing Irene's fiancé. As Irene left, she glanced sideways at her sister and said that she would never forgive her. Finally, Irene said that she would not thank her sister for such an act. Riel was very angry with her sister, because she did not expect this from her. She thought that her sister would always be with her, and would silently fulfill her every whim. The maid looked closely at the letters, and was a little surprised by one letter. She noticed that in the letter sent by Mrs. Irene, for some reason the sender's name was not indicated. She noticed that this was very strange and thought that apparently someone wished to remain anonymous. Riel looked at the maid and asked if the letter had arrived to her sister. The maid was surprised, and, looking at her mistress, said that she should not have overstrained her body with such long walks. The young lady looked at the maid and said that she just felt lonely, so she decided to get some fresh air. The maid was very agitated by the behavior of her mistress. I'm also glad that the young lady decided to take a walk. Riel looked at the letter and asked again if it was sent by Irene. She wanted to know what was in the letter. The maid said that the letter was sent by Irene, but the sender was not identified, so she wondered who could have sent it. She said that most likely this was the mistress's secret admirer, but it was still strange. Although she had heard from other maids that Irene was conducting secret correspondence with someone, Riel was surprised. She looked at the letter with a grin as she wanted to know what was there. Riel looked at the maid and said that in that case, she would hand it over herself. The maid was puzzled and asked if this could be done. Ariel looked at the maid and with a smile told her not to worry because she just wanted to make peace with her sister, and also asked if the maid could help her with this. The maid was surprised and very glad that the letter was just a reason for reconciliation. She said with a smile that in this case she would help Riel and wished her good luck. Riel nervously read the letter. She didn't expect to see something like this. Looking closely at the contents of the letter, she did not understand what was happening. The young lady was puzzled and excited. After reading the letter, Riel did not want to be alone at all. Noel arrived in the county. He saw a young lady outside the window. Getting out of the carriage, he saw Riel and was very surprised, because I expected to see Irene, not her sister. Riel smiled and greeted the young man. She said she was looking forward to it. Noel was puzzled since the young lady did not look like a maid. He looked at Riel and asked if Irene Chase would meet him later or if she was already waiting for him in the house. Riel asked the young man for forgiveness with a smile on her face, and she also said that Irene was very busy, so much so that she asked her to meet Noel. Riel smiled and introduced herself to Noel. He was surprised because he expected Irene to meet him. Noel looked closely at the young lady. He was a little surprised, as he noticed that there was a very big difference between the sisters, and he also noticed that Riel emanated a completely different aura. Riel looked at the young man and asked for forgiveness, and also asked if he could introduce himself as well. Noel introduced himself politely a moment later. He was surprised, since it seemed that Irene had not told Riel about him. Riel looked at the young man and asked if she understood correctly that he was the same Noel Kristen about whom there were many rumors. Noel looked into the distance, puzzled, and said that he was the one. Riel was very happy and said with a smile that she was a very big fan of his. Riel said that she heard that he was interested in literature and danced beautifully. And most importantly, he is a born leader, and all his servants are ready to follow him without hesitation. Riel looked closely at the young man and said that he was unlucky to be born an illegitimate son, but even under such conditions he still managed to become an heir. Riel said she admires him greatly and is honored to have met him in person. Noel noticed that there was a lot of flattery coming from her. Riel looked at Noel and asked what kind of relationship he and her sister had. Noel dryly replied that they had no relationship, but he knew that while Riel was very surprised and happy. Looking at the young lady, Noel noticed that she was very different from her sister. The young man could not forget how depressed she was at their first meeting. Riel looked at the young man and told him to quickly go inside, since his parents were already expecting him. Noel remembered what Irene had said about wanting to run away from home. Based on this, it could be assumed that the letters were not given to her. Irene sat looking out the window. She kept thinking about Noel. She didn't know whether he believed her or not. She knew that he was still her last hope. She didn't know what to do now. Irene knew that she could easily survive by selling her drawings, but the problem was that her parents were chasing her and were unlikely to leave her alone. And she was very worried about this. The parents needed Irene only because of Riel, because if she left the house, her sister would no longer have a nanny. She knew that no matter how Noel looked, this was her only chance to escape. Irene still decided not to lose heart and go find out about the letter from the maid. Irene looked at the maid and asked if by any chance she had received letters lately. The maid looked puzzled at her mistress and said that, as she had said before, there were no letters. Irene looked at the maid and asked if she could check again. The maid frowned in confusion and said that she assured her nothing had arrived, but Irene asked her to check again. The maid shouted that no letter had arrived. Irene was surprised by the maid's behavior. Irene looked at the maid with a menacing look and told her to answer honestly. She knew that the maid was hiding something. The maid hesitated, trembling with fear. She knew she had to tell the truth to her mistress. Irene looked at her and asked where she was sending her letter. Walking down the corridor, Riel said that she has heart problems and every minute for her is a fight for life. Riel said that she was forbidden to go out and walk, but this house became her whole world and everyone was kind to her. But she is very saddened by her fate. Noel was a little puzzled by the young lady's words. Riel said that this is why she is very glad to meet him, because he can manage his own life. Noel looked around intently as he was looking for Irene. Riel said that there were always people around Irene, and he himself probably heard that her sister delayed entering the academy by 1 year, and for her. But in reality, this is just a cover, to look better in the eyes of others, since Irene was constantly disappearing. Riel waited patiently for her to return and take care of her. Riel smiled and asked Noel if she didn't look like a fool. Noel looked at the young lady silently. He noticed that she was lying very vilely. He was disgusted to hear her pretend. He knew that Irene was still a real fool for putting up with such a sister. Riel looked at the guest and asked if he could wait a little, because she wants to announce that he has arrived. The young man noticed the maid and asked her to stop. Noel looked at the maid and asked if she could ask one question. The maid smiled and said that of course it was possible. A moment later, Riel apologized to Noel for the wait and asked him to go to the guests. Riel's father and mother were very happy to see Noel in their home. Noel asked for their forgiveness, since he arrived to them unexpectedly. The Count looked at Noel and said that he did not need to apologize since he was a welcome guest, and asked to change seats as soon as possible. And he also said that he hoped that the tea would be to his taste. Noel politely thanked him for his concern. Noel looked at the Count and asked if he happened to know where Lady Irene was. The Count said that Noel should be interested in knowing Riel. Noel looked at his companion, puzzled, and said that he might be interested. The Count said that Riel was in poor health, but despite this, she is very kind and sensitive. Riel constantly indulged, and Irene, in her eternal desire to hang out with friends, disappeared. Riel did nothing but give Irene love and care, but unfortunately, Irene did not appreciate this at all and spat in her soul. Riel always suffered because of her sister's selfish actions, but at the same time, she never stopped loving her with all her heart. She looked at her father and said that she was fine, and he didn't need to worry. He looked at his daughter and said that she constantly repeats that everything is fine like a mantra, but her father's heart feels how much she hurts. He looked at Noel and said that his daughter was very interested in him. Noel interrupted his companion and said that while he was waiting for Lady Riel Chase, he managed to meet 5 maids. The Count was surprised. Riel quietly tugged at Noel's sleeve. The young man was shocked by this behavior. Noel pulled back his hand. Noel said that all the maids had no idea what Irene Chase liked or where she usually went. Noel said that the maid didn't even know her taste preferences. But as soon as he asked about Riel Chase, everyone immediately answered. The Count was in shock and did not understand what Noel was leading to. Noel said he was under the impression that Riel Chase was the only child in the family. The Count was shocked because he did not understand how Noel dared to say such a thing. Noel looked at the Earl with a cold gaze and asked if Lady Irene Chase was a member of their family. Irene was shocked and did not understand how the maid could give the letter to Riel, knowing their relationship. Irene flew into the room. Riel. The maid was very surprised. The maid looked at Irene and said that Madame Riel had recently left to greet an arriving guest. Irene was shocked and thought that most likely it was the Archduke who had arrived. She was very worried and angry because she couldn't lose him too. Irene had to make it in time. She couldn't let Riel take away her last hope. Irene ran to the guest room. Irene opened the door and heard the conversation. She was shocked. She saw that Noel was saying that the family did nothing but praise Lady Riel Chase, without even deigning to say at least one good word about their daughter Irene. The father was furious and shouted that there was nothing to say about this crappy child. Noel was shocked and asked if it was normal to treat your own child this way. Irene froze in shock. She didn't understand why they were doing this to her. Noel looked at everyone present and said that he was very sorry that the girl lived in such a place where everyone hated her. He looked at them and asked why they gave her life if they don't know how to give love. Even non-biological parents try to take care of each other, as if they were relatives, unlike them. He said that even if they couldn't make her happy, they should at least try not to hurt her. Noel said that Irene is a person, not a soulless doll. After all the words, he said that this was the end of their conversation, and it was time for him to go. As he left the room, he saw Irene crying furiously. The young man hugged the young lady tightly. He knew that she needed his support now. He looked at her and said that she can give free rein to her feelings, since from now on he will always be by her side. Today Irene listened to swearing again. She wondered when she would be gently hugged and praised like her sister. She really wanted the affection and love of her parents. but still she decided to calm down and not cry anymore. She knew that Riel might wake up and be scolded again for disturbing her sister's sleep. The mother looked at Irene and said that Riel was in pain, but she was still holding on so long, she didn't understand how Irene, being healthy, dared to cry. Her mother told Irene not to make any more nagging in front of her sister. Father was angry with Irene. Riel looked at her mother and said that he drew beautiful flowers. The mother was very pleased and said that she would come to her soon. It was the first time Irene cried while hugging someone. She knew that Noel's arms were warm and gentle, and she felt very comfortable next to him. The young man looked at his companion and asked if she was okay. Irene was taken aback and said that she was very sorry because her tears got on his suit. The young man looked at his companion and said that it was just clothes and she shouldn't worry. She looked at him and agreed. She also asked if he didn't mind, then she would like to change place. She said they could go to her room. Irene looked at him and apologized for his inattention, because if she had been more attentive, he would not have had to waste so much time. Noel looked at the young lady and said that there was nothing wrong with that, since, on the contrary, he was able to find out better about Irene's situation. The young lady lowered her eyes and did not answer him. She was very ashamed that he saw something like that. She didn't want him to know what a deplorable situation she was in. Noel looked at her and asked if she was ashamed. A moment later, he said that she should not be ashamed of this, since he had a similar situation and he understood it. Noel said that she probably already knew that his grandfather, the Duke, couldn't stand him. Because of this, everyone in the mansion began to treat Noel with contempt. Everything changed after Noel became the sole heir, but only for a while. Noel said that now everything is still repeating itself since he is not recognized as the real successor. Irene looked at him as she understood him very much. She knew they were in the same position. One thing she didn't understand was how he managed to talk about such things so calmly. In a trembling voice, she asked how he could still live in such a place, since she never could. The young man said that he simply set a goal for himself to never give up and gain the respect of those who once despised him. Looking at the young lady, he said that there is no need to achieve something for the sake of universal recognition, because he can change. But the hypocrites who turned their backs on him will remain at any moment, and even Irene wants to use him in order to achieve her goal. Noel said that he was not saying that it was bad because he was also going to use her. The young lady was puzzled and asked why these words were then. Noel looked at her and said that even if she used it, she would hardly cheat. He looked at her and said that he would certainly help her escape from home and become free. The young lady was taken aback. She was very happy, because she thought that he would refuse her after what happened. Noel said she could call him by his first name since they were now in the same boat. Smiling, he asked if he could also call her by her name. A moment later, the young lady smiled and laughed. Noel was at a loss. He didn't understand why she was so amused, but he was glad that she laughed. Noel knew that all this time he had to endure the same thing as she. He felt sorry for her, since he understood her very well. Irene smiled and said that, of course, he could call her by name, and that was the end of their conversation. Irene was glad it ended this way, but she knew it was just the beginning. Riel burst into Irene's room with the speed of lightning. She was furious and asked her sister who she related to the Archduke. She wanted to know everything. Irene put the cup of tea on the table and told her sister to be careful. Irene said she wouldn't help her sister if she fell and got hurt. Riel was shocked because her sister had behaved differently before, and her changes did not suit Riel. A moment later, she began to scream again. Because she wanted to quickly get an answer to her question, she again asked who the Archduke was related to her sister. She was nervous because she wanted to hear everything. She looked at her sister and asked with a smirk if there was something between them. Irene didn't answer her sister. Riel looked at her sister and asked if Irene really wouldn't care if she fell and died. Irene looked at her sister with a cold gaze and said that it seemed that she had already forgotten what she asked of her, because Irene desperately wanted Riel to stop manipulating her and leave her alone. Riel was furious. She told her sister not to speak such heresy and quickly answered the question posed. The maids were shocked by what was happening. They never expected this. Irene looked at her sister and said that she and Noel had a special relationship. Riel was perplexed. Irene looked at her sister and said again that she has a special relationship with Archduke Christian, and she is very close to him. Riel was furious. She asked if her sister was not ashamed, since she had such a big affair behind her fiance's back. She furiously asked Irene if she had thought about Boris's feelings. Irene remembered the moment when her sister kissed her fiancé. She looked at her sister and asked if Boris was thinking about her when he kissed her sister. Riel looked at her sister, puzzled. Irene said that Boris simply does not deserve her love. She didn't want to talk about them because she was hurt by their betrayal. Irene smiled and told her sister that she could take Boris for herself. Irene wanted to get rid of her hated fiancé. Riel looked at her sister and asked if she was completely crazy. Riel couldn't understand how her sister could say something like that to her. Riel was furious and did not understand how her sister dared to talk to her, so she shouted with rage that only Irene was trash here. The parents burst into the room. They attacked Irene and asked what kind of noise she was making. Riel fell to the floor. Her parents were in shock and screamed to call a doctor immediately. They were frantically worried about her state of health. Riel looked at her parents and said she was fine. She just needs some rest. She looked at her sister with a grin and told her parents not to swear too much at her sister, since it was not her fault. The mother screamed at Irene with rage. She didn't understand what had come over her. The Countess could not understand how Irene dared to do this to her sister. She said that Irene used to be an obedient daughter of whom they were so very proud. The Countess said that now Irene seemed to have broken free. They shouted with rage that it was most likely Noel who influenced her like that. Since he was a bastard, they knew that he was to blame for their daughter's behavior. Irene looked at her parents with contempt. The parents were taken aback by their daughter's gaze. They did not expect this from her, because they thought that she would behave quietly and immediately ask for forgiveness. Irene looked at them and told them to stop throwing accusations, since they didn't even find out the whole truth. She came closer to them and said that, to be honest, they made her like this themselves. The father was furious. He did not understand what she was talking about. He hit his daughter with all his anger and rudely insulted her. He said they raised her with love, and now this is how she repays them. He said that if she didn't want to be covered in bruises, she should shut her mouth. He was furiously angry with her. Irene looked at her parents and said that they had already provided evidence of their love, and she also said that the two of them only needed her as a nurse for Riel. She looked at her parents and sister and said that she needed rest. So I asked them to leave. The father was shocked. He did not understand how she dared to tell them. The mother looked at her daughter and said that the father needed to cool down a little, and they will talk to their daughter later. The mother finally looked at her daughter with a cold and angry look and said that they would talk later. She was angry at Irene for putting Riel in such a state. Irene was shocked by everything that was happening. She was hurt by their words and actions. Touching her cheek, she felt severe pain, but now it hurt only physically, not mentally. But still she felt pain and anxiety in her soul. Looking out the window, she thought that with Noel she would endure all the pain. She hoped that he would be a support for her, with the help of which she would endure everything. A week later, Noel still hasn't sent a single letter. Irene didn't know what could have caused this. She thought that most likely something had happened. She thought that most likely his grandfather did not approve, and Autumn was very worried about this. But Irene still hoped that she was just worrying in vain. The young lady heard a knock on the door. She was surprised because she didn't expect anyone. The maid came to her mistress and said that her mother asked to come downstairs. Irene looked at the maid and asked why she would do this. She was surprised and did not understand what had happened and why her name was being called. The maid hesitated, not knowing how to say it. She said that Madame said that Irene would find out herself if she came down in person. Irene was at a loss, and the whole situation alarmed her. Irene was furious. She didn't know when they would leave her alone. She wanted peace and quiet so she could leave home as quickly as possible. She still decided to pull herself together, because she knew that she could endure everything. The young lady decided to go down and find out why her mother called her. As I was going down the stairs, Irene heard a very familiar laugh. Irene saw Boris. He smiled joyfully because he was able to see his other bride. Irene looked at the young man with contempt and asked what he forgot here. She didn't want to see him, much less talk to him. Madame looked at her daughter and asked her if she was not ashamed to behave like that in front of a guest. She told her daughter to calm down and not make her blush in front of the guest. Irene looked at them and said that she better go back to the room. She had no intention of having a conversation with him. A moment later, Boris rushed to his bride and hugged her tightly. Irene was shocked because she didn't expect him to do something like that. She was embarrassed, and she wanted him not to touch her. Boris shouted because he wanted his beloved to listen to him, since then she misunderstood everything. Irene pushed him away and told him to get away from her. She felt uncomfortable when he touched her. The young man fell to his knees and said that he admitted that he had made a big mistake because his brain was clouded and he had forgotten all its importance to him. Boris said that it is her fault, but he forgives her because he really needs her. Irene was shocked by what she heard. She didn't understand how he could say something like that. He was disgusting to her. Boris looked at her and said that he loved, appreciated, and supported her, and she did nothing for their relationship. He said that even after the engagement, she did not allow him to kiss her when the other ladies were ready to go to bed with him. She looked at him with rage and shouted at him to stop talking such nonsense. She was shocked because she had previously wanted to marry this man. She thought he was just disgusting now. But before, she once loved him very much and even planned to spend the rest of her life with him. Riel looked at her sister and said that Boris was truly sorry. She asked if Irene shouldn't forgive him. Riel said that even more so, Irene herself is to blame for what happened. Boris looked at her and said with a smile that Riel was right, since he was all about Irene, and she couldn't even sleep with him. Irene looked at him silently. She did not understand how he could say such disgusting things. He shouted that it was all her fault and told her not to remain silent, but to already admit her mistake. Irene was very scared. She didn't want to be in their company anymore and wanted to run away. She angrily shouted that she hated him. She furiously wanted to never return to such a place where no one could protect her. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and heard Noel say that a loving person would never say such a thing. She was very happy to see Noel. She knew that only he would help her in such a situation. Boris was furious. He looked at Noel and asked what connected him with Irene and how dare he interrupt their conversation. Noel looked at Boris with a cold gaze and said that he and Irene had a special relationship. Boris was shocked by what Noel said. He didn't understand what a special relationship they had. Boris furiously attacked Noel and asked what he was saying there and what exactly their relationship was. Noel looked at the young man with contempt and said that he must be deaf, since he has ears for decoration. He said that you need to listen with your ears. Boris was furious. He didn't understand how Noel could talk to him like that. He shouted that he was the only one with a special relationship with Irene. Madame was shocked by what she saw. She didn't expect something like this in her home. She just wanted Boris to convince Irene to communicate normally, and he started making a fuss throughout the whole house. Riel approached Boris and told him to calm down a little, as this was too much. Boris shouted at Riel with rage and told her to let him go. Boris pushed Riel and she fell. He looked at her with contempt. Since he didn't even push her, he realized that he was too angry with Irene and could not calculate his strength. The head of the house approached them. He looked at them and said that their noise could be heard throughout the whole house. He saw his daughter sitting on the floor and quickly walked towards her. The Count was very worried about his daughter's health. He came closer to her and asked what happened and if she was hurt. Riel said she was fine, but she is more worried about the Archduke. The father looked at his wife and daughter and said that they were probably very scared. He said that they would rather go to rest, because such stress is harmful to them, and he himself will figure it out further. Madame looked at her husband and told him to be careful. Riel looked sideways at the Archduke and asked his forgiveness for Boris's inappropriate behavior. Noel looked at Riel and said it wasn't her fault. The Count looked at Boris and said that he did not know that the young man could be so rude. The Count said that the Archduke's family was the most respected in the empire and also had high prestige in secular society, and he did not think that the Archduke would make such a fuss. Noel looked at the Count and asked for forgiveness for not warning about his visit, since he was very worried about Irene, since she had not answered any of his letters. Irene was shocked. She didn't understand what kind of letters she was talking about. She was puzzled because she did not know that Noel had sent her letters. She thought that, most likely, Riel took them away again, but she felt very ashamed in front of the Archduke. Noel looked at the Count and said that he had come to him in order to tell him something important. Noel looked at Irene and asked her to come to him. Boris looked at Irene and told her to go to her room already, since she was no longer needed here. He knew that she had always been obedient, and he knew that now she would listen to him and do as he said. Irene looked at Noel and asked for his forgiveness, since she did not even know that he had sent her letters, and she was very ashamed. Noel looked at his companion and said that everything was fine, and he didn't even blame her. The Count and Boris were shocked. Noel looked at them and said that he needed to get down to business as he had recently found out something. Noel said that Boris accumulated debts using the good name of Irene Chase, thus tarnishing the authority of the entire Chase family, and the Count can see the proof in the envelope. The Count was in shock. He could not understand whether it was true or a lie. The Count could not believe everything that was happening. He looked at Boris with rage and asked how he dared to do such a disgusting act behind his back. Irene was shocked. Irene realized that Boris had accumulated debts since they met and supported her only to use her. The Count angrily threw the documents at Boris. He was angry and did not understand how he could do this. Boris looked at the documents and said that this was pure slander, since he would not dare to do that. The Count shouted at Boris with rage, since he knew that the Archduke would not risk the greatness of his family and slander him. He shouted to the young man to know his place. The Count shouted at the young man with rage because he no longer wanted him to appear in his house. The Count said that if he were to see him again, he would crush him into powder. Boris did not beg for forgiveness and said that he was not lying to him. Boris furiously attacked Noel because he ruined everything. The servant immediately tied Boris up. Noel gave the young man a cold look and told the servant to get rid of Boris. The Count looked at the Archduke and said that he was very grateful to him for what he had done, since the young man had preserved the honor of their family. Noel said that the Count should not say anything, since any decent person would have done the same in Noel's place. The Count looked at the young people and said that in this case, he would not detain them with conversations. Irene looked at Noel and said that she still felt bad for ignoring the letters. Noel looked at Irene and said that everything was fine, since he knew very well that the letters would not reach her. Irene was surprised. Noel said that was why he gave a false visit date in the letters. Irene was a little puzzled and asked why he did it. Noel smiled and said that he did so to arrive at an inconvenient time for those who stole her letters. Everyone already knew what kind of relationship they were in, but when he took her hand, Irene felt terribly awkward. Noel stared at Irene. She was embarrassed and didn't understand why he was looking at her like that. Noel, looking at his companion, asked if they beat her. Irene was shocked by this question. She didn't expect that he might ask something like that. Irene said in a trembling voice that everything was wrong. She was terribly ashamed. She didn't want him to know about this. She was always raised as a thing that could be sold to a noble family, for money and a profitable connection. But if the thing is damaged, then no one will sell it, and no one will buy it. Therefore, Irene wanted to show her best side, but she disgraced herself. She didn't know if he could refuse her. The young man looked at her and said that she should not be ashamed of this. If she survived violence, it should not be her as a victim who should be ashamed, but the criminal who committed it. Irene looked at him and said that she really wanted to help him. Noel looked at her, puzzled. She said that they agreed to help each other, but help only comes from him. Noel looked at his companion and said that she should not worry, since he had enough of marrying him. She will help him gain the title of Archduke, but it will take a long time for his grandfather to accept Irene. Irene looked at him and said that in that case, she should see him in person. Noel was puzzled because he did not expect this. Irene said that she would like to meet his grandfather. Riel came to her parents' room. The Count looked at his daughter and was very surprised because he did not expect to see her. He asked her why she came to them, since he knew that she was not feeling well. She said she decided to come down to support them. After all, they were so nervous about her. The Count looked at his daughter and told her to quickly come to him. The Count hugged his beloved daughter tightly. Riel looked at the Count and said that she had long wanted to tell him something. The Count looked at his daughter and said that he was listening to her carefully. The Count asked Riel what upset his little princess. He said it hurt him to see her so sad. He asked to tell her what happened so that he could help her. Riel lowered her eyes and said that the fact is that just recently she told her sister about her crush on Archduke Christian, and Irene seemed to specifically decide to start a relationship with him. Ariel said that she did not want to slander her sister, but for some reason she was sure that Boris seduced her on Irene's orders. Riel said that at first she was shocked by the sharp attention from Boris because he loved his sister so much, and later she found out that her sister suddenly began communicating with the Archduke. Riel said that she immediately realized that in this way her sister decided to take the Archduke away from her. The Count was shocked. He did not understand how Irene could do this to her sister. The Count told his daughter not to worry. He said that he would deprive her of everything, and she would no longer be able to be with the Archduke. The Countess hugged her poor daughter tightly. She said that it was very difficult for her to keep such pain inside. She said that they will always be there for her and help her. Riel knew that if Noel didn't have her, then no one would have him. Noel suggested that Irene exchange letters with the help of birds. Thanks to him, there were no more problems with letters. 2 weeks after Noel left, she received a letter saying that he would arrive today. Irene looked at Noel and apologized for being a little late. The young man smiled and said that everything was fine. He looked at her and said that he would help her get into the carriage. Irene was surprised. Shyly, Irene thanked Noel. She was a little surprised, since Boris had never done this. She even thought that gentlemen should behave this way. Irene looked at Noel and asked him if his grandfather knew that she was coming to meet him. Noel said that perhaps he knows, since he told him that Irene was going to come to him, but he never heard back. He didn't feel comfortable saying that to her. Irene was a little puzzled, since very soon they were supposed to see each other. But she was very nervous. She didn't know if she could hold out and get approval. She saw their estate, and it was many times larger than she had imagined. Compared to this estate, the county is just a small fry. Irene was puzzled because she was afraid that she might make a mistake. Noel looked at his young companion and said that everything would be okay. Noel said that before she arrived, his situation was not the best, so she doesn't need to blame herself if something doesn't work out. He also asked her not to overdo it as it could harm her health. The young lady was surprised and thanked him with a smile. After his words, she felt much better for his kind words. She knew that with his support there was a chance to gain approval. Irene knew she had to get approval. The bugle servant greeted the guests. Noel looked at him and asked if grandfather was in the office. Tom looked at the young man and said that his grandfather was in the office, but he was still silent. Noel said he understood everything, and he didn't say anything new. Noel noticed the serious expression on Irene's face. He was a little puzzled because he thought that, most likely, she was getting ready to go to war. Noel smiled and told Irene not to worry since grandfather was not a cannibal. Irene was a little puzzled. Tom was shocked because the Archduke was joking. He did not expect this from such a serious young man. Irene realized that the young man was joking. She was pleased that he tried to cheer her up. Irene looked at the young man and said with a smile that she understood everything. Tom looked at the young people intently and in surprise. He did not understand what was happening at all. He did not understand and wondered if this was a profitable alliance and not a couple in love. Noel looked at Tom and told him to make sure no one came into the office as Noel didn't want anyone to disturb them. The young man said that he understood everything and would do everything. Tom thought that Noel was most likely mocking him because he did not understand who could stop him. But a moment later he realized that most likely it was those guys. Noel knocked on the door and told his grandfather that he was coming into the office. Grandfather did not answer. Noel looked at his grandfather and said that he had brought Lady Irene Chase, whom he had recently spoken about, to her. Irene said she was very glad to meet him and also introduced herself. She didn't know what to do because she was very nervous, and she started to stutter. Noel's grandfather stared out the window and did not react to the young lady. Noel was angry, such behavior of his grandfather. Irene pulled Noel by the sleeve and quietly told him to leave everything to her. Noel was surprised and puzzled. He didn't want to leave them alone. Irene said quietly that he could go and leave her. The young lady stared at Grandpa Noel and remained silent. Irene thought that he would probably be angry if she spoke first, but still she saw that he never turned to her. She thought that most likely he did not want to see or talk to her. But still, she decided not to give up and wait for the Archduke's grandfather. All the time, Irene stood and looked at him intently. Noel came into the office and told Irene that it was time to go back. The young lady was a little puzzled because she didn't even talk to Noel's grandfather. Irene told her grandfather that tomorrow she would come to see him again. So, with his permission, she will go. They left, the man staring at the door. Noel looked at Irene and asked if she continued to stand like that until he arrived. He said that all aspects of her were too reckless. Irene said she didn't think his grandfather wanted to talk to someone he didn't know, so she wanted to let him know she would wait until he wanted to talk. Irene looked at the young man and said that she didn't think it would help, but still I didn't want to give up. Irene looked at Noel and asked if he could go to his grandfather tomorrow. The young man smiled and thanked her. So Irene began to visit the Archduke's residence every day. 2 weeks had already passed, and the Archduke's grandfather still hadn't turned around. She didn't know when he would turn around and hoped that he would come to his senses soon. Irene thought that, most likely, her grandfather considered her an annoying person who was interfering in his life. She believed that everyone would think so. Noel saw Irene standing at the door again. He realized that she had been standing at the door all day again. He was furious because his grandfather simply ignored her. He looked in his direction and said that they would go, since it was simply useless. Irene looked at her grandfather sitting and said that she would come tomorrow and said goodbye to him. She heard in response something that surprised her grandfather. He told her not to come. Noel knew it was because of his illegitimate birth. He decided that he would not allow Irene to be tortured, treating her like nothing. The young man was very angry with him. Irene took the young man's hand and said with a smile that they would see each other again tomorrow. Noel looked at his companion and said that he respected her opinion and decision, but it seemed to him that this was not a good method at all. Noel looked at Irene and asked her if she knew how pale she looked. Irene looked at him silently. Irene looked at and said that tomorrow she would try for the last time, and if it didn't work, she would look for a new way. Noel agreed with her. It seemed to Irene that she would steadfastly endure this ignorance, but she was still in pain. She thought that she had become too soft because of Noel's care. When she entered the room, she saw a truly terrifying sight. The Count looked at her and said with rage that lately he had often wondered what she was doing, but she, it turns out, had taken up drawings again. Irene was shocked. She didn't understand why her father did this to her. The father was furious and shouted how dare she date Noel, knowing that he was dear to Real. He also said that he told her to stop drawing, but all she does is ignore her father. When he left, he said that she would forget about the good life. If he meets Noel one more time or starts drawing. Irene was very hurt by her father's words. She looked at the torn drawings and cried furiously. Irene was horrified by what her father did. For some time she sat silently and cried over the drawing. Irene saw Noel and apologized for being late. Noel was shocked by her appearance. He looked at her and asked if she was okay. Irene lowered her eyes and said that everything was fine with her, and also asked him to go soon. Tom greeted Lady Irene. He noticed that she was not feeling well. Irene said she was fine. She didn't want anyone to know what happened in her family. Irene came into the office and greeted Grandpa Noel. Irene looked closely at the man and asked for forgiveness for being late today. Irene said that today would most likely be her last visit to them. She said that she thought that if she waited, he would someday turn in her direction. Irene said she thought she was used to the pain and people's indifference towards her. She thought she could bear it again, but it turns out that she has become soft, and she can no longer tolerate this indifference towards herself. Irene said she didn't want to give up, but it looks like it will have to. She also said that deep down she was sure that he loved Noel, otherwise he would have kicked him out of the mansion like a mongrel. But he left him to feed, clothe, and give money to his grandson. Karen, she said that she was unlikely to ever know what the Duke was thinking, but she wanted to say that his indifferent attitude towards others hurts. She said that people are not soulless dolls who have no feelings. The Duke stood up from his chair and asked the young lady not to cry. The Count shouted at his son to kick him out and immediately abandon the boy. The young man looked at his father and said that this was his child, and he was not going to give him up. The man was furious and shouted furiously at his son. The little boy approached his grandfather. The Duke was puzzled because he forgot that his grandson was nearby. The man said that he perfectly understands the Duke's position, but the little boy also has their blood. The Archduke said that he would add it to the family register, but would never acknowledge it to his grandchildren. The Archduke told his son to quickly take him out of the office. The little boy looked at his grandfather and asked if that was his little younger brother. The Archduke looked at his grandson and said that he was his only grandson. The Archduke tried to ignore Noel as best he could. He never thought that his first grandson would be jealous, and this could lead to hatred towards Noel. When his son left the world due to illness, he began to protect his first grandson even more, and did not even try to improve relations with the second. They were moving further and further away from each other. The eldest grandson died due to a broken neck. The Archduke was furious and could not believe that he was dead. He did not understand why he was destined to die so soon. Noel constantly came to his grandfather, but he kept insisting that Noel was not his grandson. The Archduke decided not to waste time getting closer to Noel because nothing could be changed, so he decided to protect Noel. From these hyenas that eat, everything is in their way. He had to hide the fact that he wanted Noel as his successor, and he put forward impossible conditions, which he announced that Noel could inherit the title only if he married a girl whom he personally approved. But after some time, Noel brought the young lady whom he had previously told him about. The Archduke did not know that Noel would take this seriously and bring his bride to him. Most likely, she agreed to marry Noel in order to receive the title of Archduchess. He thought that if he ignored her, she would give up this idea and run away, but Irene did not lose heart and decided to fight to the end. He saw that she didn't give up, so he assumed that her intentions were pure. But even in this situation, he still could not accept her because she did not come at the appointed time. He didn't know if she had really decided to give up. The Archduke was still pondering this when suddenly he heard her voice. He heard the apology. Irene apologized for being late. She told him that today would most likely be her last visit. After all her words, he felt regret and sadness. Because of the innocent child, he thought that he most likely recognized her. The Archduke did not want to step on the same rake again, and did not want to regret what he had not done at the right time. The Archduke passionately wanted to correct the current situation at least now. The Archduke looked at her and said that he did not want her to cry. He saw the beautiful child and realized that she was simply a miracle. He did not know whether he was sleeping or not. Noel flew into the office as if scalded. Noel realized that his grandfather had finally recognized Irene, but he still knew that this was not the main thing now. Noel looked at his grandfather and asked for forgiveness. He said that he urgently needed to pick up Irene. Irene was perplexed. She looked at Noel and asked what happened. Tom looked at Noel and said that a carriage had recently arrived. Irene, puzzled, asked Noel what happened. The young man asked her forgiveness and said that he did not want this to happen. The young man looked at Noel and said that they had not seen each other for a long time and called him brother. Irene was a little surprised because she didn't know who this young man was. The young man smiled but also said that it was just a wonderful coincidence. He said that it was good that he decided to visit his grandfather earlier, namely today. The young man looked at Irene and asked Noel whether he should be addressed as brother or Archduke. Irene was perplexed. Noel grabbed Irene by the hand and said that grandfather was in the office. "And they are late," he said goodbye to the young man. The young man looked after them, puzzled, and said that he was very sorry, since he wanted to talk with them a little more. He said that next time he thought he would have better luck. From the exosa, he looked at the young lady and said that next time they would talk a little more, while he addressed her by name. Irene was shocked. She didn't understand how he knew her name. Noel walked towards the carriage with lightning speed. Eileen called him. Noel looked at the young lady and apologized for the inconvenience. Irene said she was fine and also asked who it was. Noel said it was Count Ascardo Rixus. The young man was Noel's cousin. Noel said that, unlike him, the young man is a purebred aristocrat and has every right to become the successor to the Kristen family, just like Noel. Noel said that he did not tell Irene this so that she would not be nervous again. Noel said that if she marries him, the young man may begin to set him up, and her life may be in danger. Therefore, if she refuses to marry him, he will understand everything. Noel said that he should have told her this earlier so she wouldn't waste her time. Irene shouted and interrupted Noel. She looked at him intently and said that this would not happen. Noel looked at her confused and puzzled. She said that, of course, she was surprised because she thought that the main obstacle was getting her grandfather's approval. Irene said they promised to help each other. So, she is ready to endure all these obstacles with him. She told him not to be upset, as everything would be fine. Noel laughed. Irene was perplexed. He was glad to see such a reaction from the young lady. Noel looked at her and thanked her with a smile. He was pleased by her words and felt peace in his soul. Irene looked at him confused. She knew that together they were strong. She smiled and also laughed, as she was glad that they were together. She knew they would go through a lot together. Noel looked at the young lady and said that she no longer needed to visit his grandfather. Irene understood everything. Since Grandpa had finally turned around, she still thought it would be better if she continued to visit him. After all, he can change his mind. Noel said that he would do everything himself from now on. Irene asked for forgiveness in a trembling voice, since she could no longer help him. Noel looked at her and said that she could do anything, since the most important thing now was to break ties with the Chase family and also renounce the inheritance and all the rights that she had as a member of the Chase family. Irene knew that when she married Noel, she would leave Chase County and become a member of the Archduke's family. But the problem remains in the face of her parents. After all, they will be able to interfere with Noel in every possible way, since Irene will still be their daughter. This problem can only be solved if she gives up all the rights she had as a member of the Chase family. Starting from the inheritance that she could inherit to subsidies from the state, moreover, she will be deprived of justification of everything that belonged to the Chase family. Roughly speaking, there will be no turning back, since it is impossible to return to the family after voluntary refusal. Irene knew that of course she could leave the family forever, but she wondered what if Noel didn't get the title. Noel looked at the young lady and asked her if he successfully inherited the title, they would continue to be married or get divorced. He said that looking ahead, if they divorce, he gives her a guarantee that she will live without needing anything for the rest of her days. Irene looked at him and said with a smile that she would try to give him an answer as soon as possible. Noel smiled and said that he would wait for her, but this could not be delayed. Irene smiled and said that she understood everything, and also wished her a safe journey. She knew that she didn't have much of a choice, but she still needed time to think everything over and make the right decision. Noel watched intently as Irene walked away little by little. He hoped that he would receive an answer from her soon. To be honest, Irene really doubted whether she should give up everything like that. She was very worried that Noel might not receive the title, but she also did not want to stay in a family where only Riel was valued. She didn't know if it was possible that her family would still treat her better. She was in hellish pain from the last memories. She saw the light burning and wondered if they were waiting for her. The Countess looked at her. The Countess was very angry. Irene remembered what her father told her, that she would forget about the good life. If he meets Noel again, or starts drawing, Irene was perplexed. She thought that most likely her father would raise his hand against her again. The mother rushed to her daughter and hugged her tightly. She said that everything will be fine now. The Countess told her daughter that she must have been very sad and lonely because she and her dad did not pay enough attention to her for a long time. Irene was shocked because she did not understand why her mother decided to repent. The Countess said that they should not have been angry with her because she felt so sad and lonely. Irene saw Riel, who was looking down at her and grinning. Irene felt uneasy. The Countess said that Riel told them everything because she was very worried about her condition and said that Irene was very lonely without her parents. The Countess said that if it were not for them, she would not have contacted the bastard, Noel. Irene knew this was a lie. She was glad that she had learned to distinguish between lies and truth from her family. Irene pushed her mother away. Irene said that she was very tired and wanted to lie down in her room. The father was angry with his daughter. He did not understand how she dared to interrupt the elders. Irene looked at her father and asked him not to come near her. The Count was furious and raised his hand to his daughter. He was furious and didn't understand how she even turned her tongue to talk to her own father like that. The Countess asked her husband to calm down because she believed that Irene was like this because of his cruelty. The Count was furious. He said that this could not happen since he always punished her in moderation. He said that they did everything so that she could live and not need anything. And yet she grew up spoiled, and also twisted the bastard's head and took Riel's boyfriend away. Irene shouted for her father to stop. She didn't understand how she could take Riel's boyfriend away when they hadn't even seen each other. Moreover, Noel was not at all vile, but a good person who, on the contrary, helped her. The Countess looked at her daughter and said that if she wanted to help her parents be more influential among the aristocrats, then she could be with the Archduke. But still she said that Irene chose the wrong man, since the next successor would be Rixus. Irene said she would only marry Noel. She also said that she was going to marry Noel not for the sake of the title or profit. Riel was angry and looked nervously at her sister. Irene looked sideways at her sister and said that she and Noel wanted this together. Irina said that they can say whatever they want, but the decision will not change. The Count was angry. He came closer to his daughter and asked with anger what she just said. Irene slowly walked away to the door and didn't notice that it somehow opened. Irene fell into Noel's arms. Irene was shocked because she didn't expect to see him. The young man looked at her and asked for forgiveness for the intrusion. Noel noticed that the lights were on in the estate today. Although it was usually cold and dark, sometimes it seemed to him that Irene welcomed the darkness because it was the only way she could avoid confrontation with her family members. but he knew that today they were guarding her. He was very worried and wanted to check on her and leave immediately. The young man heard her say that she would marry only him. He didn't know whether he should go in because he thought she might be threatened. He looked at Irene and asked if she was okay. She looked sideways at him and said that she was fine. The Count looked at the young man and said that now the main culprit of all their problems had appeared. The Count said that the young man brought one to tears, and the other went crazy because of him. Irene was shocked, since the Count hinted that she stole Riel's boyfriend. The Count was furious and asked the young man if he knew how much Riel had suffered because of him. Riel ran up to her father and asked him to calm down. Riel tearfully asked the Archduke for forgiveness and said that she wanted her sister to also forgive her, because if it weren't for her, nothing like this would have happened. Riel said that, to be honest, she had been in love with Noel for a long time. Riel said that when she told her parents about this, they thought that her sister had deliberately started dating a guy she liked. Riel told her sister that she knew her sister wouldn't do that. Noel looked at Riel and said that there had been a big misunderstanding, since he was the first to approach Lady Irene. Riel was shocked and did not understand why he did this. She was furious because things weren't going according to her plan. Noel said that only Irene makes his heart beat wildly, so he wanted to meet her. The Count was shocked. He did not understand how the young man could speak like that in front of a sick child who loved him. Noel looked at the Count and said that he had not changed at all, and did not understand at all what was causing Irene pain. The Count was at a loss. Noel said that the Count does not care what pain and resentment Irene feels. The Count looked at his daughter and told her to quickly answer him whether the Archduke was telling the truth. He said that Irene was healthy and living in abundance. He didn't understand what kind of offense there could be, because he knew that she was just a spoiled child. Irene looked at Noel and said that she accepted his offer. She said that she would only marry Noel, and if her parents were against it, then they could safely assume that she was no longer their daughter, and Riel was not her sister. Her parents were shocked by their daughter's words. They never expected this from her, because they thought that she would come to her senses and be with them. Irene was glad that she told them everything she thought, since she simply had no choice. She knew that she had to do just that in order to leave the house as quickly as possible. The Count looked at his daughter and said that she could do what she wanted, but he also told her to remember that once she regretted her decision, there would be no turning back. The Countess said that they tried to understand Irene, but in return for their kindness, they received piggish treatment. Riel looked at her sister and said that she had no shame or conscience. She said that Irene was a traitor who abandoned her parents, who fed and raised her all her life. Riel said that she is not a person, and without a family, she is nothing at all. Irene looked at her sister and said that they were the ones who treated her like nothing. Riel looked at her sister and said that she would regret it, and they would watch her sing after the Archduke abandoned her. Noel looked at her and told her not to say such things. Riel said that my sister is now God's dandelion, but soon he will be tormented by her behavior. He said he didn't care what the lying girl thought, so that she can end such a circus. Riel looked at him and said in a trembling voice that if he wanted to marry for the title, then he might as well choose her. Noel looked at her and asked who needs a liar like her. He was shocked by what she was saying. He didn't understand how he could say something vile. Noel looked at Irene and said that if she had nowhere to go, then he was ready to receive her in his mansion. He looked at her and asked warmly if she would like to go with him. Irene was a little puzzled. She looked at him and asked if his grandfather would mind. Riel grabbed her sister's hand and asked her not to leave. Riel said that Irene would lose her family forever. If he leaves now? She asked her if it was possible to abandon her parents and sister like that. Riel asked her if she had forgotten how much they loved her. Irene looked at her sister and said she had stopped manipulating. She said she didn't want to stay in a place where she was being used. Riel screamed in rage that she was ungrateful because she was leaving her family for some guy. She said that her parents spent a lot of effort raising her. Noel said that he tried not to interfere for a long time, but he was already tired of all this, and he no longer intended to watch it. Noel said that the decision to have a child was only the parents'. He thanked for raising Irene. Noel asked if Irene could stay with them when they forbade her, beat her and use her. Riel looked at Irene and asked to leave the Archduke. Noel said that he would stop telling Irene what to do and asked Riel not to ruin Irene's life with her antics. Riel angrily wished for them to die on the same day, like a sweet couple. Noel looked at Irene and said that this is only her life. Noel said that no one has the right to interfere in her life. Irene smiled and thanked him for standing up for her. The young man looked at his companion and asked if he could help her pack her luggage. Irene thought a little, since she only had drawings that her father tore. Irene said she had nothing to take away. Noel said that he understood everything and invited her to go to him soon. Irene was a little puzzled, because she didn't understand when she managed to fall asleep. Irene was a little embarrassed and hoped she wasn't sniffling. Noel looked at her and told her not to worry and to get some more sleep. Irene looked at the young man in confusion and asked how long she had been sleeping. Noel smiled and said that she had slept enough, and he even began to fall asleep himself. The young lady asked for his forgiveness. Noel laughed and said he was joking since she had only slept for 5 minutes. Irene looked closely at the young man, as it was difficult for her to understand whether he was lying or telling the truth. Noel looked at the young lady and said that she should quickly go inside, as she could use a good rest. Tom looked at the young people in puzzlement and surprise, because he knew that Noel was supposed to see the young lady off and return immediately. Tom thought that most likely the young people were going on a date. Noel looked at the young man and asked what the expression was on his face, since a lot had happened today. He asked to take the guest inside. Tom looked at the young people and said that this was just a terrible story, after they told him everything. Then he looked at Irene and said that no one would touch her on the estate. He looked at her and told her to follow him, and he would show her to the guest room. And if she suddenly gets hungry, he will happily bring her something. Irene looked at him and said that everything was fine and she was not hungry. Irene looked at him and thanked him for his concern, calling him a butler. The young man smiled and said that she could just call him Tom. Tom looked at Noel and reminded him of one thing. Noel said that he remembered everything and would sort everything out, and he also asked Tom to take care of Irene. The young man said that he would do everything in the best possible way. He was surprised because Noel said to take care of the young lady. The young man was surprised by the last big change in a short time. Tom looked at Irene and said that she could stay in the guest room for now, and by morning he would have her private room ready. Irene looked at him and asked for forgiveness for the inconvenience. Tom said that she did not need to apologize. On the contrary, he was ashamed that he had to accommodate the future wife of the Archduke in the guest room. The young lady smiled. In response, Tom said that a little later the maids would come to her with clean clothes for sleeping, and if she needs anything, she can safely ring the bell. The young lady thanked the young man for his concern. Irene was glad that the day was almost over, as she was very tired. She knew that all the difficulties were worth it, because she achieved her goal. She thought that if she had not gone to the ball then, it is unlikely that Noel would have saved her. The young lady did not even want to imagine what would have happened to her if she had not met Noel. Noel looked at her and told her not to be nervous. The young lady agreed, but she was still very scared. Last night, Noel told everything to Grandpa, and he asked to bring Irene early in the morning. She was terrified because she thought that Noel's grandfather would most likely throw her out into the street. The man looked at them and said they could come out. He looked away shyly and greeted the young lady. The young people were surprised because they did not expect this. Irene greeted Archduke Kristen. The Archduke said that Noel told him yesterday that she had switched. The Archduke said that it must be very difficult for her. The young lady was surprised, but still thanked him. The Archduke said that from this day on, their home is her home. He said that she doesn't need it. They are afraid of him because he treats her very well. The man looked closely at his grandson as he still wanted to say something. For some time they stood silently and looked at each other. Noel looked at his grandfather and said that he was listening carefully. The man looked at his grandson and timidly said that he didn't want anything and he could calmly go about his business. Noel said he understood everything. Irene timidly called to the Archduke. Irene came closer to him and thanked him. The Archduke looked at the young lady and said that everything was in order and she did not need to worry about it. She was very grateful to the master, just for the fact that he simply allowed her to live in the Archduchy. But most of all, she wanted to thank him for opening his heart for her and trying to get closer to Noel, but she knew there was no need to say that. Noel looked at his companion and said that it seemed to him that grandfather liked her much more than he thought. The young lady was very happy to hear such words, as she was very nervous. Tom ran up to the young people because he couldn't find them anywhere. He looked at them and said that a bedroom had been prepared for Lady Irene on the second floor. He began to explain to her where to go, but a moment later he said that he would rather take her himself, as he was afraid that she might get lost. Noel looked at him and said that he himself would see Milady off. Tom looked at them puzzled and asked if he could come with them. Noel looked at him with a cold gaze and said that they would go together. Tom was a little surprised, as he did not expect such behavior from his master. Noel looked at him and said that he and Irene were having a private conversation. Irene looked at Noel and asked what he wanted to talk to her about. He said that they needed to do something because they needed to set some rules for the contractual relationship. He said they needed to draw up an agreement. Irene knew that drawing up a contract was the most basic procedure. Noel looked at the documents and said that first, we need to discuss the goal itself. He said that he was becoming an archduke and she was cutting ties with her family. Noel said that, however, they could not immediately dissolve their relationship if the truth came out that they had entered into a marriage contract in order to leave the house and gain the archduchy. He said the situation could get more complicated. He said that they would have to stay married for at least 2 years. In other words, even if Irene didn't like him, they couldn't break up. Noel looked at her and asked if she agreed. Irene smiled and said she agreed. Noel was surprised because she answered very quickly. Irene looked at him and said that she wouldn't hate him. She lowered her eyes in embarrassment and asked if they would be close enough by then. Noel looked at the document and said that he understood everything, and there was one more point that needed to be discussed. Noel said that if after 2 years of marriage everything ends in divorce, then he will pay her 500 gold pieces every month for 90 years. Irene was a little surprised. He said that of course he would also help with housing and basic necessities. Irene looked at him, slightly taken aback, and said that was too much. Noel said that the archduchy she would give him would not be worth anything like what was listed, so he thought it would be reasonable. Irene was a little puzzled because she thought it was too much. She would like to object, but the young man looked at her with a steady, serious gaze. Irene agreed with him after a moment. The young man smiled and said that he had outlined all his conditions. He looked at her and said that if she wanted to add something, she could talk. The young lady was a little embarrassed and didn't know how to start a conversation. She looked at him and asked what to do with marital relations. The young man was a little taken aback. Noel said that they become spouses from the moment of their wedding, to be precise at the moment of signing the marriage certificate. The young lady looked at him confusedly and said that was not what she meant. Noel looked at her confusedly as he understood what she was talking about and said that he had not yet thought about the heir, so that they could discuss it later. The young lady sheepishly agreed with him. He looked at her and asked if she would like to complete the points. Irene said she didn't think so. As a result, he and Noel agreed to hide the marriage contract in a secret safe, which was located in one of the corners in the library, and pull it out at the end of the contract. Noel said that she had cast 5 different spells on the vault, and even the archmage would not be able to enter inside. He said she could come up with the password herself. The young lady was a little surprised and confused, but a moment later she said that the password would be ballroom night. The young man said that this was a good option, since that day they met for the first time. Irene smiled and said that in that case they had already completely figured it out. The young man looked at her and said that there was something, since their marriage still needed to be announced. Noel said that in a month there would be a reception to mark the 700th anniversary of the founding of the Archduchy of Kristen. He said that the news about the wedding could be announced at the reception. The young lady was a little puzzled. Noel once again repeated to her what he had said a few minutes ago. Irene was shocked and frightened by this news. Noel said that members of the imperial family, representatives from each publishing house, aristocrats from the center along the sideline, as well as grandfather would gather there. Irene looked at the young man, puzzled, and asked him to wait a little, because they didn't get permission from his grandfather. And if they announce a wedding in such a place, nothing can be returned back. Noel said that their marriage would be recognized at a meeting of the important people of the imperial family, and through the publishing house, this news will spread throughout the empire. Noel said that in this case no one could interfere with their wedding. Irene knew that this was a risky plan, but at the same time very effective. Those who are against Noel becoming an archduke are most likely indirect relatives, the archduke and Countess Gardo. There is no way they can harm Noel. with his current well-being, then with a high degree of probability their target will be Irene. However, if the public were told about Irene, it would not be possible to act hastily at the official reception. So she remembered Noel's words that he had said before, that it would be dangerous. The young man looked at his companion and said that in this case she should always be near him. Noel told her not to leave his side. Irene smiled and said that she understood everything and would never leave his side. She wasn't afraid at all, even in this situation, because she knew Noel would be there. Noel looked at her and said that in that case they would see each other tomorrow morning. Irene looked at him and shyly asked where she could get paper, pen, or paint. Noel said that the paper and pen were in the desk drawer, and he would look for paint and the necessary supplies tomorrow afternoon. Noel looked at her and asked what else she needed. Irene thanked him and said that this would be enough. Noel said that there was nothing to thank him for, and if she needed anything, she could definitely tell him, since this was her home now. Noel wished her good night and slowly left the room. Irene, in turn, immediately started drawing. Since she had not drawn for a long time, she was very happy, since this could be done not in secret. She knew that now she could draw with the window wide open. The stars and crescent moon sparkling above the sky between them are a simple but elegant garden, and in the center, she saw young people. She was surprised because she saw Noel talking to someone. Irene stared at Noel. She didn't know who he was talking to. She noticed that Noel's interlocutor had blue hair. A moment later, Irene realized it was Ascardo Rixus. She noticed that the situation between them was very tense and difficult. She felt awkward looking at them. She stared intently from the window, as it was too hard for her to hear what they were talking about. A moment later, her diary with a drawing fell out the window. She was scared because she realized that she might be noticed because she was making noise. The young men looked intently to see who was listening in on them. Irene was scared because they noticed her. She knew that it was in vain to eavesdrop on them, and as luck would have it, she dropped the book with drawings. She thought that soon they would probably have turned away. A moment later, she looked out the window and noticed that they were no longer in the place where they had been a couple of minutes ago. She looked intently at where her diary had fallen, since it was hard to see because of the darkness. She knew that at the time of admission, she would quickly pick up the book and paper before someone else found them. As she left the room, she saw Noel. Irene was shocked because she did not expect to see him and was very scared. She thought he was very funny because she overheard them. Noel looked at her and said that he saw that she had dropped her drawing and book and therefore came to return them. Irene was a little puzzled as she realized that he was aware. She looked at him and said embarrassedly that, to tell the truth, she saw the two of them talking and dropped the book and paper by mistake. Ascardo likely knew too. Irene was a little puzzled. She didn't want this to happen and she was very ashamed. Noel looked at her intently and smiled. He knew that everything she was thinking about was written on her face. The young man looked at Noel and said that they had bumped into each other again, and it was not just a coincidence. He looked at Noel and asked if the sky was beautiful today. Noel looked intently at the young man and did not answer. He noticed that they were standing right in front of the window of Irene's room. Noel realized that Ascardo was next to Irene's room for a reason. Noel realized that the young man wanted to see her. The young man said that he had heard that Lady Irene Chase had decided to live in the Archduchy. Noel looked at him and said that all the news reached him quickly. The young man looked sideways at Noel and said that he was very interested in learning something. Noel didn't like the young man's interest in Irene, but he knew it was inevitable. A moment later, he said that he was curious to what point she was going to stay by his side. The young man told Noel to better get rid of the delusion that they could be together all their lives. He said that Noel has dirty blood, and therefore he cannot truly love. Noel knew that he didn't need love to begin with. After his grandfather's betrayal, he stopped hoping for someone's care, and the same goes for Irene. Even though she is a good person, he didn't even think he was expecting something more. However, Ascardo will do anything to take Irene away from Noel. He really hoped that Irene would not leave him. Irene looked at the young man and asked if he was okay, because he looked a little puzzled. Noel looked at her and said that even if she wanted to leave for someone else, he couldn't let her go. Irene was very surprised, as she did not understand the young man's behavior. She wondered what happened to him and Ascardo, since after their conversation, he began to say similar things. She noticed that Noel looked worried and puzzled. She looked at him and said that this would not happen, since she only needed Noel and no one else. She smiled and said that's why he doesn't have to worry. She didn't want him to be upset. Noel smiled because he was very embarrassed. He asked her for forgiveness and said that it seemed that he had worried in vain. He was glad to hear such words from her. Irene didn't know what was wrong, but she was very glad that Noel seemed to have calmed down. After a busy night, Noel could not sleep for a minute. He remembered Irene's words that she didn't need anyone but him. Irene's voice couldn't get out of his head. He thought that in their relationship he was supposed to comfort her, but it turns out that he relied on her. Tom came to Noel. He was puzzled by his condition. Tom said Noel just doesn't have a face. He asked him if he slept at night. Tom told Noel to try to go to bed early and get up early. Tom said that there was only a month left before the wedding was announced, so Noel needed to get himself in order. Noel looked at him and asked if he was teaching him. Tom said that in no case, it's just that if he belatedly announces the wedding announcement, which will take place at the reception in a month, he will then have to deal with matters in the swamps. Noel asked the young man for forgiveness, puzzled. Tom was surprised that Noel was apologizing so simply. He knew that Noel had always been like this, unlike other aristocrats who considered their power paramount. The heir always admits his mistakes and does not hesitate to ask for forgiveness. For this reason, Tom continued to follow Noel. Tom looked at him and told him not to apologize, since he was his arms and legs, and Noel could lead him as he wished. Noel looked at the young man and said that he did not consider him a simple servant. Noel said that it was thanks to him that he was able to hold out in this deserted mansion. Tom was very surprised and embarrassed by these words. He was pleased to hear this. He was embarrassed. Noel saw the letter and asked Tom what it was. The young man said that this was an invitation from the Jasmine Duchy. Irene woke up in a very good mood. Since she didn't know the last time she slept so well, she never got much sleep in Chase County because she had to take care of Real. If it weren't for Noel, she probably would not have fallen asleep without any worries in her head. She wondered if Noel slept well. The maid came and saw that the young lady had already woken up and was surprised. Irene looked at her and asked if she had really come to wake her up. The maid said that under no circumstances did she come to wake her up. The Viscount simply told her to quietly leave her the water for washing and leave. Irene was surprised because she didn't know who the Viscount was. The maid said that she meant the secretary of Mr. Viscount Tom, the Esquan family well, for their talents in trade. The head of the family of the last century expanded his activities from the provinces to the center and became a hot topic of discussion. Among people, the Esquan are even now considered a fairly influential family. Irene, of course, did not think that the Viscount would turn out to be an ordinary person, but he is truly an outstanding person. She was surprised and did not understand how great Noel was then, since the Viscount himself was following him. The maid looked at the mistress and said that since she woke up, she would inform the master. Irene said there was no need for that. She wanted to go to him herself. The maid was surprised, and Irene in turn said with a smile that she would go to him herself. The maid smiled and said that the master was now in his office and also asked if Irene would be shown in. Irene smiled and said that she would be grateful to her. Irene looked at the maid and asked for forgiveness. The maid was a little puzzled. Irene looked at the young people who had gathered near the painting and asked the maid what reason they had gathered for. The maid said that in the morning works of famous artists would be displayed in the corridor. However, it seems that some kind of problem has arisen. Irene looked at the painting and asked the maid if she could go there for a while. The maid said she could do it. The young man looked at the picture and said that his order was correct. Another young man looked at the picture in surprise and asked the young man why he needed eyes, since the order of the seasons was as follows: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. The young man was puzzled and asked where it was winter, since he saw a garden and flowers in bloom. The young man, puzzled, said that if it snows, it means it's winter. He also said that he needs to wait a little for the head butler to come, and then they will ask him. Irene looked at the young people and said that it was winter. The young people were surprised and frightened by Irene's unexpected appearance. Irene smiled and apologized for interjecting abruptly, as it seemed to her that they were discussing the time of year in the picture. She looked at them and asked if she could take a closer look at the work, as she thought she could help. The young people said that they did not mind. The maid thought that with a simple outlook, it would not be easy to unravel this picture. It was painted by a little-known artist, and she had not yet seen the worldly light. By a lucky chance, the Archduke noticed this painting and decided to exhibit it in the mansion. The maid knew that even if the answer was wrong, she should play along a little. Irene looked closely at the picture and said that the order is spring, summer, autumn, and winter. The young man was puzzled and asked, since it was winter, why the flowers were in full bloom. The painting depicted a landscape, but he had not heard about winter in which flowers bloom. Irene said that this work belongs to a little-known artist, Karu. At first glance, this painting may seem like a simple landscape, but in fact, the artist wrote it, remembering abandoned love. She said that the seasons changed each other, but the artist wanted the place in which the two were together to remain unchanged. That is why they can see unwilted flowers. They said that this landscape does not exist in real life. However, she said that only the artist himself knows the truth. Irene watched intently and admired the beauty of the painting. She had not seen Kara's painting for a long time. She remembered the first time she saw his work in Chase County. She liked them so much that she even started looking for others. Irene said that if you look at it in order, it really is spring, summer, autumn, and winter. She said with a smile that although she might be wrong. Noel approached them and said that she was telling the truth and everything was correct. He was glad that she liked the picture. Irene was a little surprised, but also pleased by his appearance. She said with a smile that she was just on her way to him. Noel smiled and said that it was very good that they crossed paths. Noel looked at her and asked what she was doing. The young woman specifically said that they were simply discussing the picture. The young people were in shock and did not know whether this was exactly their master whom they knew. Noel looked at his companion and asked if they could move to the greenhouse, as he had something to tell her. Irene obediently agreed. The young people slowly walked to the greenhouse. Noel noticed that she was a little behind. A moment later, Irene noticed that the young man had adjusted his pace to suit her. She smiled for a moment, and later she burst out laughing. The young man was surprised and asked what made her laugh so much. She looked at him and asked for forgiveness, and she also said that his concern for her looked very nice. The young man was surprised by these words. He felt a little embarrassed. He looked at her surprised and embarrassed and asked if she thought he was cute. Irene smiled and shyly said that she said that as a compliment. She thought that most likely he might be unpleasant, but she knew that he really was a sweetheart. The young man, puzzled, said that he understood everything. Irene was a little surprised and didn't know if everything was okay. She looked at him and realized that it looked like she was worrying in vain. The young man was a little puzzled as he looked cute in her eyes. He heard various praises in his direction, wonderful, reliable, and more. However, this was the first time he had been told that he was cute. The young man was puzzled and could not understand why so many thoughts appeared in his head from some of her insignificant words. Noel looked at his companion and said that rarely anyone walks in the greenhouse, so you can talk calmly. Irene was surprised. She said that she did not know that there was such a wonderful place in the duchy. He looked at her and asked if she liked it here. Irene smiled and said she really liked it. Noel thought it would be nice to have tea with sweets as well. He thought that next time he would have to tell Tom to prepare them. He thought for a moment. Irene called him because he wanted to talk to her about something. The young man looked at her and apologized because he was lost in thought. He said that it seemed to him that she was showing great interest in painting. Irene knew he realized this when she asked him for painting tools. She couldn't even believe that he remembered such a little thing. She smiled and said that was exactly how it was. The young man said that this was very good and asked why don't they go to the event together. He said that an invitation had come from the Jasmine Duchy. They were opening an exhibition in support of poor aristocrats. Noel looked at her and asked if she wanted to go with him. Noel said that if she wanted to go without him, she could say so and he would organize everything. Irene shouted in joy that she agreed. Irene was embarrassed because she came too close to him in celebration. Taken aback, she smiled and said that she would be very glad to go with him, and also thanked him for asking. Noel said that the event was in a week, and she had not gone out for a long time, so he thought that he should stop somewhere along the way and buy something for her. She smiled and said that she would definitely do so. Irene looked through and tried on all the dresses she had. She was a little puzzled and didn't know what to do. She realized that she simply had nothing to wear to the exhibition, since there were no dresses from Chase County in the room. All the outfits that Noel prepared for her were casual. She was a little puzzled because she remembered the dress at the last moment. But still, she decided not to become limp and not shed tears. She needed to go to the store. She remembered that she had 12 gold pieces. She really didn't want to spend this money. After all, they were payment for her painting, but relying on Noel is not a good idea now. She wanted to find Tom to ask for a carriage. Unexpectedly for her, she saw the Archduke. He asked where she was in such a hurry. Irene was a little embarrassed. She said she needed to buy something, so he runs after the carriage. The Archduke looked at her and asked if she wanted to go without security. She knew that she was just going to buy a dress and did not understand what the point of security was. The Archduke looked at her intently and smiled. He asked her if she wanted to go together. The young lady looked at him puzzled and asked if he wanted to go along. He looked at her and asked if she wanted to or not. The young lady said that this was not the case at all, and she wanted to go with him. The Archduke smiled and said that in that case everything was fine, and then they could go and ask for a carriage. The young lady smiled and they walked slowly. Tom was puzzled and did not understand what was going on, as Noel constantly bombarded him with questions. Noel asked Tom if he was cute and in what place he was cute. Tom was puzzled and said that he didn't know. He didn't understand Noel's behavior. Tom looked and saw that the Archduke was getting ready for a walk with Lady Irene. The Archduke looked at Tom and told him to prepare the carriage. Tom was surprised, because he knew that the Archduke was a man who did not communicate with anyone, and now he was next to Lady Irene. Tom thought that they simply had a contractual relationship with Noel, which would come to naught after achieving the goal. But looking at everything that's happening, he thought that most likely he was simply mistaken. Tom bowed obediently to the Archduke and said that he would do everything. Irene slowly walked up the steps of the carriage. The Archduke gave her his hand and said that he would like to help her. Irene was surprised and embarrassed. She thanked the Archduke with a smile. All this time, she did not notice that the Archduke and Noel had many similarities. She saw the closed lips forming a straight line, the eyes with a brownish tint, even the deep and caring tone of the voice. The Archduke looked at her and asked if there was something on his face. The young lady looked at him puzzled and said that he had nothing on his face and asked for forgiveness as she was looking at him very intently. The Archduke smiled and said that everything was in order, and he also asked what she would like to buy and called her a sweetie. Irene smiled and said that she just wanted to buy a dress. The Archduke was surprised. Irene said that she and Noel agreed to go to the exhibition tomorrow, and that's why she wanted to dress up for the event. The Archduke looked at her and said with a smile that she should have told him right away, and he would have prepared a beautiful dress for her. Irene smiled and thanked him for his kind words, but she also said that it was such a special day that she wanted to buy the dress herself. They arrived at the boutique. Irene was very surprised, since it was the first time she had seen such a large boutique. The Archduke told Irene to go inside for now, and he would quickly look somewhere and come back. Irene smiled and said that she understood everything. Entering the boutique, Irene met a young lady. The young lady greeted Irene. Irene said she would like to buy a dress. The young lady asked if Irene would like to pick up something to order. Irene said she wanted a dress that she could put on straight away. The young lady looked at Irene and asked if she had come alone. Irene was puzzled and did not understand why they were asking this, but she said that she was alone. The young lady looked at Irene and asked how much she expected. Irene said she was counting on 12 gold pieces. Irene knew that 12 gold pieces was not so little. The young lady asked Irene to sit down and showed her the catalog. She told Irene to look and decide which dress she wanted to choose, and also asked if she needed a catalog with accessories. Irene said she would just pay. The young lady said that's what she thought. She also said that Irene could call her when she decided on an outfit. New visitors came to the store and the saleswoman immediately went to greet them. Irene decided to quickly choose a dress. She was surprised because she saw many different styles. She really liked the blue dress, but it was very expensive. She knew that with her budget she wouldn't be able to afford it, but it wouldn't hurt to take a look too. Irene slowly looked at the catalog. The young ladies noticed her and began to whisper. They said that judging by the endless turning of pages, this was some kind of aristocrat from the provinces, and this became clear when she came here alone without any security. Irene decided to ignore them and continue choosing a dress. She found what suits her. The young lady approached her and poured a glass of water on her. The young lady asked for forgiveness with a grin and said that she had simply slipped up. The young lady said that such clothes should be thrown away. She also said that she would compensate her for all the damage and asked where the young lady was from. She said that as soon as she found out, she would order the servant to bring her a new dress. Her companion looked at her and asked why she needed the extra trouble. The young lady said that she could not pass by a person who had such a misfortune. Irene sat and was silent. The young man looked at her and said that the lady of the Rose family said that she would give her compensation. He didn't understand why she was sitting and silent. Shortly before she left home, Viscount Roses visited her father and almost bowed at his feet. She knew that, come to think of it, the Viscount had exactly the same red hair. The young lady looked at Irene with contempt and anger and asked if she had decided to ignore her. Irene knew she could soften the situation by saying she was from Chase County, but then her parents would have found out about her, and she didn't need that. Irene said nothing bad happened and she was fine. The young lady just laughed. The young lady was very angry and asked Irene if she dared to neglect her kindness. She said she wouldn't do that and wanted to beat the crap out of her. The Archduke saw that the young lady wanted to hit Irene. He was furious and looked at them with a fierce look. He asked how to understand this. He was shocked by everything that was happening. Everyone present was shocked and did not understand why Archduke Christian was asking such a question and why he was in the store. Everyone started whispering because they didn't expect to see a man in the store. They couldn't believe whether it was him or not. The Archduke approached Irene and asked what happened, since he saw that her head was all wet and her dress too. Irene lowered her eyes and said that it was nothing and that she was fine. The Archduke looked at the young ladies and told them to quickly bring a towel. He did not understand why they stood rooted to the spot and did nothing. The Archduke looked at Irene and asked if she was hurt anywhere or not. He also asked if anyone wanted to harm her. He told her not to be afraid and to tell him everything. Irene looked sideways at the young people who were responsible for the incident. The Archduke was furious. He looked at the young people and asked Irene if they dared to touch her. The young lady was scared and did not understand what was happening. She just wanted to play a little joke on Irene, mistaking her for a low-born and tactless aristocrat. But then the Archduke suddenly appeared and began to defend her. The young lady was shocked and scared. She realized that most likely Irene was from some high-ranking family. She knew that no matter what, she was finished. The Archduke angrily said that they should answer him now. Irene looked at the Archduke and said that she was fine. She did not want to involve the Archduke in such a situation. Irene approached the young lady and said that she in no way disdains her good nature and is also not against compensation. Irene said that, however, she considered it wrong to put pressure on a defenseless person with her power. Irene knew that if she really wasn't from an influential family, she would have received a slap in the face, and I couldn't say anything in response. The young lady said in a trembling voice that she was very sorry. Irene wondered if she could only receive an apology in the presence of the Archduke. The Archduke looked at Irene and asked if she had found the dress she wanted. Irene said she hasn't found anything yet. Irene knew that she could do nothing and would have to ask the maid. She, of course, wanted to wear the dress that she bought for herself, but it was unbearable to continue to be in such a place. The store employee apologized for not immediately recognizing the customers and said that if they liked some outfit, they would be happy to provide it. The Archduke angrily said that they would get by, adding that they would not come to this store again. The young lady was puzzled by this answer. She knew that their boutique was blacklisted, the Archduke, in front of all customers. From tomorrow, only flies would fly in the store. The Archduke and Irene rode in the carriage in silence for some time. Irene looked at the Archduke and realized that he was still bothered by what had happened. The Archduke called Irene. She looked at him in surprise. A moment later, the Archduke asked her if she was very frightened. Irene smiled and said that everything was in order. The Archduke said that if something like this happened again, she would definitely need to tell him. Irene smiled and thanked him. They were silent for several minutes. She saw that he wanted to tell her something. The Archduke looked at her and said that unfortunately he did not know what her tastes were, so he chose at his own discretion. He asked her to tell her if she didn't like it, and he would quickly change everything. Irene was shocked. She did not at all expect to see the rings, and certainly did not expect the Archduke to buy them himself. He looked at her and said that since they were going to an exhibition tomorrow, he would like to give rings for such an important day. The Archduke said that he was afraid to give the rings to Noel, as he would not accept them. The Archduke asked if Irene could do this for him. Irene looked at him, puzzled, and said that she really liked the gift and also thanked him for his kindness. But she also said that she didn't think she could ask Noel to wear a ring. She knew she had to say these words for Noel's sake. Irene said she didn't know everything that happened between them, but he feels how deep the wound Noel received. She said that she understood that he was doing all this for the benefit of his grandson, but she knew that it was also difficult for Noel. But still, she said that she would try to tell Noel. From his sincere heart, she also asked for forgiveness if she crossed the line. Irene knew that she would also be confused if her family suddenly asked her to accept their gift because they wanted to get closer. She might even be unpleasant. She didn't want to become that person for Noel. The Archduke knew that Irene was right. It was probably not easy for her to say this, but she looked clearly into his eyes without looking away. The Archduke knew that this was not the first time this had happened. He knew that she was conveying to him something that he could not understand. The Archduke thought that perhaps Irene could comfort Noel's wounded soul and help restore their broken relationship. The Archduke looked at the young lady and asked for forgiveness. He said he was wrong. Irene said everything was fine. The Archduke looked at her and said that he should not have been in such a hurry, and he would listen to her words. Irene smiled and thanked him. She knew that until that moment no one had taken her opinion into account. And now it's as if she's been recognized. Irene looked at the Archduke and thanked him for today. The Archduke looked at her and said that he should thank her. The Archduke looked at her and said that he had not talked so calmly with anyone for a long time. Irene said she was very happy to spend time with him. She felt comfortable with him. Irene knew that she needed to ask the maid to prepare a dress for tomorrow. Approaching the bed, she saw the box and was surprised since it was not there in the morning. The maid looked at her and said that the master had left a gift for her. Irene was surprised, and when she opened the box, she saw a beautiful dress. She was very surprised because it was a dress from the first page of the catalog. She knew it was so expensive that she didn't even consider it as an option. The maid said that apparently the master had prepared an outfit for her for tomorrow. She looked at Irene and asked if she wanted to try on the dress. Irene smiled and said that she really wanted to try it on. The maid smiled and told Irene that it fit her just perfectly. Irene asked the maid if Noel personally came to her. The maid said that he came just before she arrived. Irene knew that if she ran right now, she might be able to see him. The maid was puzzled. Irene knew that Noel took the only path from her chambers to his office. She saw his silhouette and was very happy. Irene called Noel as she ran. The young man turned around and was surprised because he did not expect to see her. Noel was shocked, as he did not expect to see such a sight. He looked at Irene and asked what happened. A moment later, he told her not to say anything and to begin by regaining her breathing. He told her to take a deep breath and exhale slowly. Irene smiled and said that the maid told her that he gave her a dress. She thanked him with a smile. The young man said that there was no need to thank him. Since he invited her, his duty was to take care of everything else. For a moment, they stood and looked at each other intently. Noel looked at her and said that the new dress suits her very well. Irene thanked him again with a smile and said that the dress was truly wonderful. Noel noticed that she had something in her hand and asked what she was holding. Irene knew that if she showed the rings, Noel might start avoiding her. But she also knew that the Archduke gave them from the bottom of his heart, and she needed to muster up the courage to say everything. Irene opened the box and said that it was a gift to them from the Archduke. Irene said that the Archduke said it would be nice to wear these rings to the exhibition tomorrow. Irene noticed that he was silent and thought that he was most likely angry. Irene looked at him, puzzled, and said that if he didn't want to, he didn't have to wear them, as she respected his choice. The young man looked at her and asked what she thought would be the best thing to do. Irene looked at him, puzzled, and sheepishly said that she would like them to put on the rings together, since there would be a lot of people at the exhibition. She thought it would be a good idea to show them their matching rings. Irene knew she said one thing, but in reality she just wanted to wear matching rings with Noel. Noel looked at her and said that he agreed with her, and he also asked if she would put a ring on him. Irene was surprised because she did not expect this. Noel said that it was a gift from her, so he asked her to put on the ring as soon as possible. Irene knew that the Archduke had given her the rings so that she could give them to Noel. She didn't know if it could be called a gift from her, but still she decided not to dwell on it and put on the ring. The young man looked at her and told her to give the box to him. Irene noticed that Noel had very long and beautiful fingers, and she also noticed that he had slightly prominent veins on the back of his hand. She knew he had wonderful hands. Irene looked at him and shyly said that very well, that the rings are the right size. Irene was very embarrassed because she didn't understand how she ended up so close to Noel. Her heart was pounding wildly, and she almost jumped out of her chest. Noel looked at her and asked if she would give him her hand. Irene was a little surprised. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that she had recently said that it would be nice to wear matching rings. He looked at her and said that's why it's her turn now. Noel looked at her embarrassed face with tenderness and warmth. A moment later, Noel, looking at the young lady, said that the ring fit perfectly. Irene was very embarrassed. She didn't know if it was possible to die from a broken heart. The maids calmed Riel. They looked at her and asked permission to take her to her chambers. Riel said that there was no need for this, and she would go to the room herself. She also asked them not to follow her. The maids were puzzled by the mistress's behavior. Riel was infuriated by everything. She couldn't understand why they were screaming and whether their screams should make her feel better at all. Riel knew that if Irene were in their place, she would calmly give her first aid. She did not want to be born in such a body. Riel heard the maids talking. One of the maids said that she really missed Lady Irene, since she has a very reserved and mature character, and Lady Riel, every time she becomes more and more irritable and irritable. The maid said that this had never happened before. Another maid said that it could not be otherwise, since Riel sits at home all the time, and Lady Irene lives with another person. In such a situation, everyone would like to escape. The maid said that this is probably why Lady Riel behaves this way, because of envy. Riel was very angry, and she didn't understand why she should be treated this way. She knew it was all Irene's fault. The maids looked around the corner and saw Riel. Riel's face changed with lightning speed and asked the maids what had happened. The maids smiled and said that it was nothing. They really hoped that she had not heard anything. Riel looked at the maids and asked what they had in their hands. She saw the letters that arrived today. The maid said that she had sorted them and the letters. Riel was already in her chambers. Riel looked at the stack of letters and asked whose letters the rest were. The maid, puzzled, said that this letter was for Lady Irene. True, now it will be difficult to convey them, so she decided to simply remove them. Riel told the maid to give the letters to her. The maid looked at her mistress, puzzled. Riel told the maid to give the letters that came to her sister. The maid was a little puzzled and did not want to create problems like last time. She asked Riel for forgiveness in a trembling voice and said that she could not convey them to her. Riel became very angry and hit the maid in the face. Riel looked at the maid and asked if she really considered her an empty place in this house. Riel said that of course she apologizes, but at home she can do whatever she wants, just like opening all the letters. Riel said it's all because she's the real daughter. Riel smiled and asked the maid's forgiveness if she was hurt. She said that it was also very difficult for her without her sister. Riel looked at the maid and said that since she understood everything, she would like to receive the letters. Riel sat and carefully examined all the letters. She saw that Jasmine Dochi was putting on an exhibition and was serious. The maid looked at Irene and said that she could open her eyes, since this was not a ball. They emphasized nobility and grace rather than luxury. Irene was very happy and thanked the maids with a smile, as she really liked the amazing image. The maid was very glad that she was able to please her mistress. She said with a smile that now it was time for her to leave, and the carriage would be waiting for her outside. Noel waited patiently for his companion. Irene was fascinated by Noel. She noticed that he was dressed so beautifully that you couldn't take your eyes off him. The young man looked intently at his lady. A moment later, looking at her, he said embarrassedly that she was beautiful. The young lady smiled and shyly said that he looked great too. They held hands very naturally. Irene noticed that Noel had large and warm palms. She didn't know why her heart was beating so much. They're not even a real couple. She knew that she needed to watch her face, and it was only a duty to accompany her if Noel found out about her personal interest in him. Then he might become unpleasant. The Archduke looked at Irene and said that he had come to wish her a good journey. Irene thanked him for his concern. The Archduke looked at Noel and said that he would also like to wish him a good journey. The Archduke saw that his grandson was wearing the ring. He smiled and wished him a good journey. The young man thanked his grandfather. Irene looked at Noel and said that she thought he was braver than she thought. Noel was puzzled and did not understand in what sense. She said that if she were in his place, she would certainly run away, but he did not avoid answering. The young man looked at her and said that it was all thanks to her. The young lady was surprised. Noel said that he himself would have run away before, but now there is Irene next to him, namely the person who is his support. Irene smiled shyly and said that everything was because marriage with her would help him become an archduke. Irene felt some discomfort in her chest. She didn't know why she hurt him with her words. She wanted to throw all vain hopes out of her head, since she was already up to her neck with enough disappointments in life. Noel looked at her and said that it wasn't just what she said, but of course, thanks to her, he would actually have the opportunity to inherit the title. But her presence alone already gives him strength. He looked at her and said that she was much more amazing than she thought. He said he didn't mean to burden her with these words. He just wanted to convey his point of view. Irene shouted that his words did not burden her at all. She embarrassedly said that, on the contrary, she was only happy to hear such things. Something happened on the road and the carriage shook. Irene could not stand on her feet and fell. Noel looked at her and embarrassedly said that it was dangerous to get up from her seat when the carriage was in motion. The young lady asked for his forgiveness. Noel looked at her and said he was just worried, as if she didn't hurt herself somehow. Irene sheepishly said that everything was fine, so he could let her go. For some time they looked out of the windows in embarrassment. Noel looked at the ring that Irene had on her hand and became very embarrassed. He thought that he seemed simply out of his mind. He thought that he should stop giving his heart to Irene, since he thought that he should not hope for their relationship, since it was already determined. He didn't know why then, despite all this, his gaze continued to strive in her direction. The young man looked sideways at the young people and said that they had arrived at the place. Noel politely shook hands with Irene. Irene, in turn, embarrassedly thanked him. Irene saw a wonderful reception. She did not expect such a large-scale reception, but however, she knew that nothing less could be expected from the county. The young lady looked at Irene and greeted her as well. She said that this was their second meeting. Irene thanked Lady Jasmine for the invitation. The young lady said that she would like to thank Irene for increasing the reputation of the exhibition. The young lady smiled and said that she was very glad that Irene had brought such an outstanding personality as Mr. Kristen to them. Noel greeted the lady and thanked her for the invitation. The young lady looked at the young people in confusion and asked how they came together on the same carriage. The young man embarrassedly said that there was a special relationship between them. The young lady looked at them and asked if it was a secret. Noel said it's no secret, but they wouldn't want to make a fuss. The young lady smiled and said that such news would not be easy to hide at the ball. But now they are at an exhibition where everyone is admiring the works of art. So she said she wouldn't bother them. Irene smiled and thanked the young lady for her understanding. The lady looked at the young people and said that, anyway, she was very grateful to them for coming, and also said that since they both came to the event, she wished them a great time. The young people were a little puzzled and embarrassed. Noel looked at Irene and said that this dialogue had sucked the soul out of him. Irene smiled. Noel looked at her and said that he wanted to ask her something. Irene was surprised and asked what he wanted to ask for. Noel said that he didn't know much about art, so he asked her to be next to him and tell him everything. Irene was a little surprised. She said that of course she would help, but, truth be told, her knowledge is not particularly impressive. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that there was nothing wrong with that, since he understood much less than she did. The young lady smiled and said that in that case he should trust her. Noel said he would certainly do so. While looking at the paintings, they came across a work called The Roar of Karbal. A character named Kerbel commits a crime for the sake of his beloved, but as punishment he becomes a guard of the gates of hell. In the picture you can see how he splashes out his anger by committing unwanted murders. Noel said that if you don't know everything before history. It seemed like there was just a roaring beast in front of him, but now the picture no longer filled him with fear. Irene saw how lonely and languidly the character was crying when no one cares about him. Very similar to her, from the past, she didn't even have words. The young lady gazed at the painting. Looking at the picture, Noel said that he probably met his beloved. Irene was a little puzzled. Noel said that the character saw his beloved, and became so happy that he forgot the hardships he had to go through. Irene knew that, conditional or not, there was no justification, but she wanted to believe that it was so. Irene smiled and said that this was probably the end they would end up with. Irene felt calm and light in her soul. She hoped that the happy time would never end. Irene heard a voice that was very familiar to her, and which she never expected. Riel saw her sister and said with a grin that they had not seen each other for a long time. Riel looked at her sister and said that she missed her very much. Irene was a little puzzled and excited. She didn't understand why failure always overtook her when everything had just gotten better. Riel looked at her sister and said that she had a beautiful outfit. Riel reached out her hand to Irene. Noel grabbed her hand. She looked at the young man and with a grin told him to let go of her hand. Irene looked at Noel. She said she didn't want to make a fuss at such a formal event. Riel looked at him and said that she, like the heir, Archduke Crystal, who attempted to harass a defenseless girl, thought she would also not want to make a fuss. Noel looked at the young lady with contempt and disgust. He was furious and wanted her to leave as soon as possible. Irene was shocked by her sister's statement. She was disgusted to listen to such things. Irene was shocked as everyone was whispering behind her back. It was very difficult for her to breathe, and she wanted to quickly run outside. But she knew she couldn't put Noel in a difficult situation. Besides, it was no longer possible to run away. She knew she had to face her sister. Noel looked at his companion, puzzled. Irene looked at her sister and said that they needed to talk outside. So she asked her to follow her and remain quiet. Riel immediately turned around and went outside. Irene looked at her companion and apologized for ruining their viewing of the exhibition. She asked him to wait a little and said that she would be back soon. The young man looked at her and said that she had nothing to apologize for, and also asked if he needed to go with her. The young lady smiled and said that she was fine and it was her business, and so she should handle it herself. The young man said that in this case he would wait for her at the place of the tea party. Riel glanced sideways at her sister and said that she thought they had moved away enough. Riel looked at her companions and asked them to be left alone with her sister. The young man was puzzled. He said that the Count gave orders to protect her in any circumstances. The young lady said that he would interfere with her talking to her sister. Riel grabbed the sword from him and said that if even one scratch appeared on her neck, his head would fly off his shoulders. Irene was shocked and asked Riel to calm down. The young man looked at Riel and said that he understood everything and also asked him to let go of the sword as it was dangerous. Riel said that the sword is for protection and it will stay with her, and she also told them to leave. The young people bowed obediently and left. Riel looked at her sister and asked if she would be glad for her to die. Irene looked at Riel, puzzled, and asked what she wanted to do. Riel looked at her sister and asked if she wanted to say that she was wrong. She said that by leaving home, it was as if she had signed her death warrant. Riel said that it is very difficult for her because without her, all the servants ignore her and no one cares about her. She frantically begged Irene to come back home. Riel said she was very ill and, unlike Irene, she was born with poor health. Irene looked at her sister and said that they were no longer sisters, and also asked how many times she needed to repeat this. Irene said that she had already cut off all ties with her family, so all her antics were pointless now. Riel angrily said that it seems that Irene is the smartest and threw the sword at her feet. Irene noticed that a little more and she would have hit her with the sword. Riel looked at her sister with contempt and asked who she thought she was. She didn't understand where there was so much impudence. She said that her sister did not know her place at all. Irene said she knows herself very well. Riel looked at her and said with a grin that she was mistaken, because if it weren't for their family, she would have been in the grave a long time ago. Irene looked at her and asked what it meant. Riel said that she wanted to ask her one question. Riel turned away from her sister and said that she came here to say that she would regret her decision. She did not understand why, but her sister cannot understand how difficult the path she chose, running away from home, where she was safe. Ariel said that nevertheless, it is not too late, since the parents have already cooled down to some extent, so that Irene can return back. Irene said that this would not happen and asked her sister to leave. Riel looked at her sister and asked if she was sure that Noel would not leave her. Riel said that once Irene is no longer useful, he will no longer need her. She said that when a better candidate comes along, she will 100% become a real headache for him. Irene looked at her and said with a smile that she did not need to judge, especially since such a thing would not happen, since she was loved much more than Riel could imagine. Irene said that Riel has it written on her forehead what her current situation is at home, and that is the reason why she came here. Irene looked at her sister and said that if she wanted to take away what belonged to her, then she would not allow it. Riel was very angry because she knew that the young man would leave her as soon as he considered her tender. Irene heard everyone whispering as they frantically discussed Noel. The young people discussed the rumors that had been circulating about Noel since they first met him. They knew why he came to such an event, since they knew that he did not particularly like them. They whispered and did not understand who would marry such a man with such a fate. They felt sorry for him, since he was attractive to all intents and purposes. Irene was upset because she knew that Noel had definitely heard them. She looked at his sad face and realized that he was pretending not to hear anything. She didn't know how many such situations he had experienced. She knew she shouldn't worry about something like that. She just wanted to be close to him. Irene called the young man and asked for forgiveness and also asked if he had to wait for her for a long time. The young man came closer to her and said that there was nothing wrong and everything was fine. He also asked if she was okay, as he noticed that her face was red, as if she had a fever. Irene said that everything was fine. It just seemed to her that it was quite hot here. Of course, she knew that everything was wrong. It was all her fault. Because of his attractiveness, she could not calm down. After everyone saw them together, they began to frantically whisper and say that their combination was unusual. Irene was even glad, as rumors spread very quickly. He looked at her and asked what they should do now. He said that if she wanted, they could go on and look at the paintings. Irene knew that now was not the time or place to look at the paintings, since all eyes were focused on them. She looked at him and said with a smile that they just had to leave. She smiled and said that everyone was looking at them in such a way that she would like to leave this place. Noel looked at her and thanked her. The young man thanked her for her support and for the fact that she had become closer to him, and thanks to her, he is increasingly gaining hope. Noel looked at her and said that he didn't even know if his meeting with her was his most successful event in life. Irene thought that this was most likely a dream, since her heart was beating very fast and she could not even say anything. She smiled and said that she thought the same as him. The young people furiously discussed the issue, since they did not think that there would be a girl who would want to marry the Archduke, and the man said that she agreed. Rumors had it that she also received the Archduke's approval. They were furious because they knew that if the girl married the heir, he would receive the title. One man shouted that they urgently needed to deal with the girl by any means necessary. One of the men present said that they did not know what was on her mind, since there were rumors that the Archduke liked her very much. If they touch her, it will only harm their position. The man looked at everyone present and asked if they knew anything about this girl. The young man looked at him and said that he had seen her several times in the estate. The man was angry because the young man said that he had seen her, but he had not told this before. The young man looked at everyone present and said that he thought that she was an ordinary girl, so he did not expect that she would receive the Archduke's approval. But he did not expect this, and therefore did not inform them and did not pay special attention. The young man was very angry because he believed that the Archduke was against Noel. After the death of his grandson, he did not think that Noel could receive the title of Archduke. The main character of this incident is a girl Noel, the only factor in these changes. The young man secretly found out about her. But she is just an ordinary girl. He did not understand how an ordinary girl could change the situation. The man looked at them and said that they should stop their wedding. The young man said that he had thought about this situation. After a while, he said that he would go first, since he still needed to prepare for the trip to the Duke's estate. 23 years ago, there was a revolution, and a new emperor ascended the throne. But the emperor was in the role of a puppet in the wrong hands. In fact, the strength of the Archduke Christian family is more powerful than the imperial family. The main task of the clan is to maintain strength and ensure that it exceeds the resources of the emperor. The young man knew that he would do everything possible to receive the title of Archduke. The young maid smiled and said that now there are a lot of rumors in society. Earl Chase's estate is now overflowing with invitations for milady. Irene was a little puzzled, since no one knew that she was not there yet. Rumors about her unusual relationship between her and Noel began to spread, and the fact that the Archduke liked her caused the maids who looked up to her to whisper among themselves every time she passed by. Even now, people came every day who wanted to enlist Noel's support. They usually ignored her, but because the Archduke recognized her, people thought that the head of the house had decided to transfer the title to another person. In other words, Noel became a major problem for the younger Count of Escardo. Irene stared at the drawing. Since the mansion is visited by many strangers, Noel asked her not to leave the room. Thanks to this, she could devote more time to creativity. She knew the weather was wonderful today and thought maybe she should paint the entrance to the estate. Opening the window, she saw many carriages. Irene was surprised, as she did not expect to see so many carriages near the mansion. The maid looked at her and said that these were gifts for the banquet and they were brought here. Irene was a little puzzled. The maid said that next week there would be a banquet at the estate to mark the 700th anniversary of the founding of the family, and these were gifts to appease the head of the family. The maid said that at this time of year there are a lot of carriages in the estate anyway. Irene realized that at this time the wedding would be announced. She didn't know if everything was normal if she was here. She met Tom one day and he looked very exhausted. She realized that it was because of the preparations for the banquet. She didn't know if Noel might be in the same situation. She knew that she had a lot of free time. Irene really wanted to meet Noel. Noel was so busy that she didn't think he would be able to come to her. Irene looked at the maid and asked if she could help her. The maid was puzzled and didn't know if everything would be okay. Because if someone finds out, there will be problems. Irene smiled and said everything would be okay. She felt safe, but she couldn't just sit and wait. Irene left the room and heard the young people whispering. The young man said that he heard that Lady Chase was here, so he came here. He wanted to know if she was really there. He said that at first he didn't believe it when he heard that an unmarried woman was living in someone else's house, and couldn't believe it. They whispered and did not understand how she could even live in the Archduke's house. One young man said that if they got engaged, they might start living together, but now no one has seen her. Irene walked past the young people. She decided to act calmly since she was wearing a maid's outfit. The young man saw her and said that the maid looked quite unusual, since her hair was similar to the description that he had heard. The other man was a little surprised and said that this was a simple maid. The young people called Irene. She decided to pretend she hadn't heard anything. The man decided to pull Irene by the hand. He was very angry. But the young man pulled her back and did not let her be grabbed. He smiled and said that he had finally found her. The young man smiled and said that someone had spilled water, so he needs her help. The man was a little puzzled by the behavior of the younger earl. The count looked at the men present and asked what problems they had with his maid. The man said that there was no problem. It just seemed to him that he knew her. But maybe he was wrong. The count smiled and said that in that case, they would go. Irene was scared and didn't know what was happening. The count looked at her and said that he thought no one would see them, so that she can take off her scarf. Irene, embarrassed and puzzled, thanked him for his help and said that thanks to him she could leave. The count looked at her and asked with a smile if, in this case, she could give him a few minutes of her time as a reward for his help. Irene looked away, puzzled, and said she was sorry, but she had somewhere to go. She knew that Noel was very afraid of this man. She felt like she was betraying Noel with her behavior. The count looked at her and said that her behavior was strange, since he just wanted to talk to her for a few minutes. Irene looked at him and thanked him again for his help, but she didn't have time at the moment. He looked at her and said that he understood where she wanted to go. Noel approached them and looked at them with a cold and angry look. Irene was embarrassed and very glad that he showed up on time. Noel took her hand and asked the young man what he wanted from his bride. The count looked at them with a grin. Irene was very embarrassed that Noel called her his fiancé, but she realized that now was not the time to be touched by his words. The count looked at him and said with a grin that he was just helping his bride and just asked her for a small favor. Noel looked at him and said that he could help him instead of her. The count looked at him and said that unfortunately it was not his help that he needed. He looked at him and told him to give up in that case, and now he didn't even dare to ask Irene for anything. Noel turned around with lightning speed and pulled Irene along with him. Irene looked furtively at the count. The count looked at her and said with a grin that they would see each other soon. Irene was very angry and did not understand why she even turned around. Noel held his hand tightly. Irene and she were not in pain at all. She was surprised because he held her hand very tightly but at the same time very carefully. Noel looked at her and asked what was going on. He was surprised that she was looking for Escardo and in different clothes. Irene said, puzzled, that she was wondering what was going on outside and also really wanted to meet him, but it was very busy everywhere. so she thought that if she took the maid's clothes, then hardly anyone would notice her. Noelle asked what she was doing next to Escardo. Irene said that when she was caught, he helped her. Irene noticed that Noelle was very angry. She knew she had to apologize. Noelle looked at her and asked for forgiveness. Irene was confused and didn't understand why he was apologizing to her. Noelle said that he put her through some bad things and he had to find her first, but I was so busy that I completely forgot about her. He asked for forgiveness again. Irene said, puzzled, that everything was fine. Noelle looked at her and said that no matter what, she should not get close to Escardo, since he is very dangerous. Irene looked at Noelle and said that she wouldn't make him worry about her anymore. Noelle looked at the young lady intently and embarrassedly. He thought that apparently seriousness was her habit. The young man said that he was going to tell her something about the party soon. Irene was a little upset because she understood exactly why Noelle was looking for her. She realized that she had upset him greatly and she needed to stay and wait for him. Noelle looked intently at his companion. He looked at her and said that luckily she came first. Noelle said that he was worried about the nobles who had gathered at the gate. Not so long ago they did not respect him, but now they are simply persecuting him. He looked at her and said that thanks to her, he was able to avoid them. Irene realized that Noelle was trying to calm her down. She could not describe her emotions because their relationship was built on a contract. She didn't understand why her emotions were so obvious that even Noelle could understand them. She knew that if this continued, it would not lead to anything good. She looked at him and thanked him for this. She said she would be careful in future. Irene said that she would remember that their relationship was based on a contract. Noelle was puzzled, as again his heart hurt greatly from her words. He looked at her intently and saw kind puppy eyes, olive eyes, wheat hair, and white skin. He knew that in 2 years they would have to separate. He did not understand why everything turned out this way. Noelle didn't want to let her go. Noelle said that they would have to discuss a lot. So he invited her to sit down and also asked if she would like coffee. Irene said she wouldn't mind having coffee with him. She was a little surprised since it was her first time in Noelle's office. She knew that he was very busy preparing for the banquet, but his room was not in disorder. She knew that, in fact, she was the only one in the estate who did nothing. Noelle looked at her and asked what she was thinking. He gave her a cup of coffee and said he hoped it would taste good. Irene smiled and said that it was like trying some kind of dessert. Noelle looked at her and sheepishly said that he liked sweets, so he made it himself. Noelle said Tom said it was too sweet. He asked what she thought about this. Irene smiled and said that she also really liked sweets. Noelle smiled and said he was very lucky. Noelle expected that she wouldn't like it, but it's quite the opposite. Irene was surprised that Noelle made the drink himself. Noelle said that the banquet would begin at 6 o'clock. In order to attract everyone's attention, they would enter after the banquet began. Noelle looked at her and said that Tom is the only one who knows that they will announce their wedding that day. Noelle said that it was completely unknown what would happen, so they needed the Archduke's permission. He said that he would go and ask his permission. Irene looked at him and asked if everything would be okay. Noelle smiled and said everything would be okay. He said that if she was brave, then he should be brave. Irene was a little surprised and embarrassed. Noelle said that it would take a lot of courage to cut all ties with her family, but she did it because she wanted to go her own way. He said that is why she is so brave and he should become brave too. She smiled and said that in that case he should not overdo it. Noelle smiled and said that as soon as they announced the wedding, they would arrange it immediately. Irene was a little surprised and embarrassed as she felt like he was proposing to her. Noelle looked at her and said that he would call the maids to help her with her clothes. Noelle looked at her and said that he also wanted to change her maid and asked Irene if she would mind. Irene was a little surprised. She said she didn't mind. Noelle looked at her and said that she would have a new maid today. He asked if she wanted to say anything. Irene smiled and said it was nothing special. She quietly whispered to him everything she had in mind. Thanks to Noelle, she was able to return to herself. She was very tired and needed to take a bath quickly. The young maid greeted Irene. The maid looked at Irene and said that it was a great honor for her to meet her. Irene was a little surprised, but said with a smile that she was also very glad to meet her. Irene said that she could just call her by her name instead of lady. The maid was a little puzzled and said that Viscount told her to address her respectfully. The maid looked at Irene and asked if she could call her Lady Irene. Irene smiled and said that, of course you can. Irene realized that Tom's introduction of her was rather embarrassing, of course, but she liked this treatment. The maid looked at her and said that her name was Louiselle and she could call her by her name. Irene smiled and said that it was a very beautiful name, and it suited her very well. The maid looked at her and apologized for her rudeness and asked if she could ask her one question. Irene said that of course it was possible. The maid looked at her and asked why she didn't ask her. Irene was a little puzzled and didn't understand what she was talking about. The maid asked why she didn't ask her about the scar. Because every time someone sees her scar for the first time, they always ask about it. But she didn't. Many people asked her about the scar. At first, everyone looked at her with disgust. Once they know the cause of the scar, they begin to hate it. She knew that Irene definitely noticed the scar on her face, even if she was a kind person. She was still curious how Irene would react. Irene looked at her, puzzled, and said that was all because she was not curious. The maid was surprised, as she did not expect such an answer. Irene looked at her and said that she also didn't understand something. Irene said that she, in turn, would also like to ask her a question why she is not interested in the reason why Irene left home and went to the Archduke's estate. The maid said it was because she was not interested. Irene was puzzled and asked why. The maid said it was because it was none of her business. Irene smiled and said that it was the same with her. Irene looked at her maid and said that she was not interested in the situation of others. The maid looked at Irene intently. She didn't expect this. She realized that her experiences looked simply ridiculous. She didn't know how to describe her feelings. It was the first time she had seen someone treat her like that. Deep down, she truly wanted to protect Irene as much as possible. Irene looked at the sword and asked if it was too inconvenient. The maid said that she was a maid, that she was capable of fighting, and she was much more comfortable when she had a weapon at hand. She said that it was quite the opposite, and it was much more inconvenient to wear maid clothes over armor. Irene looked at the maid, puzzled, and asked if she had to dress like a maid. The girl said that the master ordered her to hide the fact that she was a battle maid, but there was no way to hide a sword, but armor could be hidden. Irene remembered that Noel said that after the wedding many dangers would await them, so he changed her maid. The maid said that Irene would soon become the mistress of the estate. She didn't understand why she was communicating so formally with someone like her. Irene looked at her confusedly and said that she was just guests. She looked at the maid and asked how she could not respect the other people of the estate. The young lady said that she was just her maid. Irene was a little embarrassed and didn't know what to answer. A moment later, Irene smiled and said that she understood everything, while addressing the maid by name. The young lady smiled and said that this was very good. Irene looked at the young lady and said that her smile was simply beautiful. The maid looked at her and told her not to flatter her. Smiling, she said that she just tried to say it like it is. Noel looked at Tom and asked if the painting had been found. Tom said it was found through rumors, and it wasn't hard to buy it at auction. Tom looked at the gentleman and asked why so suddenly. Noel said it was Irene's decision. Tom looked at him and asked if this was the younger milady's future decision. Noel looked at him, puzzled, and said that it was a strange nickname. Noel looked at Tom and asked if anyone besides them knew that Louiselle was a battle maid. Tom said no one knows. Since her armor is hidden behind the maid's clothes, she has to carry a sword with her, but it's still okay. Noel calmed down a little because he wanted to stay with Irene, but however, he could not stay with her all the time. Therefore, he was very glad that in case of danger the maid would be able to protect Irene. Tom said it was very good. He was a little puzzled because he couldn't get used to that expression on Noel's face. Noel took the painting and walked slowly. Tom looked at him and asked where he was going. Noel said that he was going to his grandfather. Tom was puzzled and didn't understand why he was going alone. He looked at him and asked if he was going to go without him. Noel looked at him and said that Tom understood everything correctly, because he has to do it himself. Noel stared at the door. He knew that he had not visited his grandfather for a long time. He always thought these doors were too big. It seemed to him as if they were so huge and heavy that he would not be able to open them. Noel knocked on the door and asked if he could come in. He knew it was like this all the time, even when his grandfather heard him from his office. He still didn't answer, as if he didn't want to see him. Noel was already used to this, but he felt pathetic at such moments. Grandfather calmly said that he could come in. Noel was very surprised. Entering the room, Noel realized that his grandfather was not sitting in the same place where he always was. Noel noticed that his grandfather was sitting at the table and was surprised. The Archduke looked at his grandson and asked what was the matter. For some time, Noel stared at his grandfather and could not say anything. Noel looked at his grandfather and said that Irene prepared this. The Archduke was very surprised. Picture called Room. Noel said that Irene said that this painting can be interpreted in different ways. The room seems empty, but there is warmth in it. Noel said that Irene was sure that the Archduke would like the picture. The Archduke looked at the picture and said that everything was correct, since the artist always draws such hidden pictures that evoke warmth and close feelings. He said he also likes the stories he draws. The Archduke said that Irene really has good taste. Noel looked at his grandfather and said that Irene really liked to draw. The Archduke looked at the painting and said that it was truly a wonderful gift, and he also asked that his gratitude be conveyed to the young lady. The Archduke gazed at the painting. Noel looked at his grandfather and asked if he was hiding something in this room. The Archduke said that his grandson was right, but he could no longer hide it. Noel didn't know that his grandfather was definitely talking about someone. Even if he said something, he wouldn't listen to him. He knew he had to return today. The Archduke said that if you chase what you cannot get your hands on, you will look foolish in the eyes of society. He said he only realized it now, but it was too late. The Archduke said that therefore he must put something that he could not find in this picture. Now he must face reality. The Archduke told his grandson that he wanted to apologize, although it was already quite late to do so. The Archduke said that he could not calmly look his grandson in the face and admitted his terrible past. He asked his grandson for forgiveness. Noel was surprised because he did not expect this. The young man, in a trembling voice, asked what was the reason for doing this right now. The Archduke said that he understands that it is too late to do this, and he does not expect Noel to forgive him. The Archduke said that his ignorance, fanaticism, and greed hurt Noel, so he wants to apologize for the pain he caused. Noel looked at his grandfather and said that he didn't understand, since it was he who set incomprehensible conditions so that he could not inherit the title. The Archduke said he did not do this because he did not want him to inherit the title. The Archduke said that he was only trying to protect him from what was threatening him. Noel looked at him and asked if he understood correctly, that in this case he agreed with his engagement to Irene. The Archduke looked at his grandson and said that everything was exactly like that, and if it was Irene, then he believed her. The Archduke told Noel that he had indeed brought a beautiful lady, and he also said that it was simply excellent work. Noel was glad that finally what he wanted was done. But he still wondered why his soul was so heavy. Noel looked at his grandfather and said that he plans to announce the wedding at the party and ceremony, and the wedding will be held immediately after that. He looked at his grandfather and said that he just had to agree. The Archduke looked at his grandson and said that he would help them in any way he could. The Archduke looked at his grandson and asked him to have dinner together from now on, and he also said that Noel could officially introduce Irene. Noel agreed with him and said that in that case, he would go. The Archduke knew that forcing Noel not to accept him was his mistake. Today, he felt empty. Noel was surprised that his grandfather bowed before him. The reason for this action was to protect Noel, as if he had said that he would allow him to inherit the title. Noel didn't understand why he was angry in that case. Noel wondered if Irene could understand why he felt this way. He knew that if he told her, she would feel uncomfortable. However, he didn't want to avoid it. Preparations were underway for the holiday. The young lady looked at Irene and said that they were finished and she would make dresses suitable for her as soon as possible. Irene thanked her and said that she tried very hard. The young lady smiled and said the same could be said about Irene. Irene was very tired after all the preparations. The maid came closer to her and said that she could give her a foot massage. Irene was surprised and said that there was no need to do this. The maid looked at her intently and said that it seemed that the lady did not trust her. Irene was a little puzzled and said that it wasn't like that at all, but if she wanted it, you could do it. Irene was surprised, as this was the first time she had experienced this. The maid said that her feet were soft and not calloused, but her muscles were tense. After the massage, Irene began to feel refreshed. She was very happy and she felt very pleased. Louiselle heard an incomprehensible noise. The maid said that someone was standing outside the door. A moment later, she said he was standing suspiciously in front of the door. The maid looked sideways at Lady Irene and told her to hide behind her back. The maid came closer to the door and was a little surprised because even when she approached, the one who was standing behind the door did not run away. She knew that he was planning to break into the room. She furiously threw open the door and put the sword to the young man's throat. Irene was very scared. She didn't know who it was because her heart would jump out of her chest anymore. The maid looked at Mr. Noel in surprise. He looked at her sideways and asked what was going on. Irene was surprised. As she did not expect to see Noel, he smiled at her with a soft smile. He looked at the maid and asked if she was going to put down the sword. The maid asked him for forgiveness. The maid looked at her master and asked why he didn't come in, but just stood at the door. Noel looked at Irene and the maid and said that he came because he had a conversation with Irene. The maid looked at him and asked why he didn't go into the chambers then. Noel was a little puzzled by this question. Irene looked at the maid and asked her to leave them as they needed to talk. The maid said that in that case you will wait outside. Noel looked at the door closing and said that this was the first time Louisel had shown sympathy. He said that she seemed to really like Irene. Irene was a little surprised and embarrassed. Irene looked at and said that he wanted to talk to her. She asked what he wanted to tell her. Noel said he visited his grandfather and gave him the painting she recommended to him. Irene was surprised and said it was wonderful, because I knew that the painting might be difficult to find. Noel said that the grandfather gave his consent to the marriage. Irene looked at him and said that this was great news. Irene looked at Noel and asked what was wrong, because I saw his puzzled face. Noel said his grandfather apologized to him. Irene was surprised. Noel said the Archduke asked for forgiveness because he acknowledged past mistakes. Noel said that the Archduke spoke the words that he had wanted to hear for a long time. Noel was puzzled and did not understand why his soul was so sad. He said there was a hurricane inside that was ready to tear him apart. He looked at Irene and asked if she knew why he felt this way. Irene wanted to say something, but Noel interrupted her and asked for forgiveness, as he did not want to burden her. Irene said she realized something while I was listening to him. She said all along she wondered how she would react if her family apologized and acknowledged past mistakes. She said that if she were in his place, she would feel sadness, not happiness. She said that questions would arise in her head, why they could not say an apology earlier, why they did not show due attention and care to her. How would she behave if she heard these words from her relatives? She said that if they had said this earlier, she would have been upset too. Noel said he thought his grandfather would never take his side, but after his sudden apology, he felt like a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders and he could breathe freely. Irene saw that Noel was crying and decided to support him. She hugged him with tenderness and care. She said everything was fine and he could shed tears. She said that if he is angry, then he can be angry. If he has an opinion and feelings, then he is not obliged to forgive. She said that if in the future his soul was hard, he could always come to her and share his experiences. The young man was surprised. He asked if this would be a burden to her. Irene looked at him and said that everything would be okay, and if he was having a hard time in his soul, then he could safely share it with her. She said that she would always be by his side. She looked at him intently, and it seemed to her as if she was looking into a mirror. Irene knew that she and Noel had similar emotional wounds, and there was only one person who could understand. She said that she wanted him to trust her as he trusted himself. Noel looked at her and said that if so, then she could share her disturbing thoughts with him, since he also wanted to help her. Irene smiled and said that he had already done a lot for her. She also thanked him and said that she would definitely think about his words. Noel looked at her and said that it was already too late, so it's time for him to leave. Irene looked at him and asked if she could accompany him. Noel said that he ordered the servants to place a tea set in the greenhouse in advance, so next time they can have tea together. Irene smiled and said she would be waiting. Noel looked at her and said that thanks to her, his soul felt better. Irene looked at him confused and said that she was very happy that she could help him. Noel looked at her and said that he hoped that in the future she would open her heart and tell her story. Irene looked at him in surprise and intently. A moment later, she said that she would definitely do so. Noel wished her good night and said that he would come to her tomorrow afternoon. Irene smiled and said that you would look forward to it, and also wished him good night. Leaving the room, the young man saw a new maid. Noel looked sideways at her and told her not to look at him so intently, since he was already leaving. The maid wished good night to the master. Noel thought that it was most likely a mistake to hire the young lady to act as a maid. After a busy day, Irene finally went to bed. She thought about everything, and for a minute she even felt jealous. Her family will never apologize for their actions. But if they did, she wasn't sure she could forgive them. In the past, perhaps she would have forgiven, since she considered them family. But circumstances have changed, since she has a monastery in which she can stay. Irene knew that in 2 years their contract would expire and she would be left alone. She knew that she shouldn't be upset after all. The maid stared at the young lady. One of the ladies said that Irene needed to try on some shoes. The designer who was next to Irene was very happy. She said that at the moment they had sorted out the shoes and it was time to complete the look, since there was little time left before the reception and they should hurry up. She said they were short on time, so they skipped the interim dress fitting, but they hoped that the dress would suit her liking. Irene looked surprised, since the dress was very elegant, but she didn't care. They slowly prepared Irene. When they completed their preparations, they were amazed by Lady Irene's beauty. Irene looked surprised and embarrassed. She did not expect to see such beauty. Irene looked closely at her image, and was very surprised, as she saw as if she was a completely different person. She didn't know if it was possible to look so dazzling. Previously, it seemed to her that she was unworthy of either luxurious dresses or jewelry. The young lady looked at Irene and said that she would steal the show at the upcoming reception. Since this dress will set the direction for this season, many ladies will want to use amber, sapphire, and pearls as jewelry. The maid saw the young lady and said she looked beautiful. She said that Irene is so amazing that no one can compare to her. Irene sheepishly thanked Louiselle. The maids bowed and said that with this they would leave her, and they also wished her a pleasant time. Irene was a little surprised, as she still did not believe that this was all happening to her. Noel knocked on the door. Irene was a little scared. Noel asked if he could come in. Noel walked and said that the reception would start soon. He said he thought it was time for them. Noel saw the young lady and was very surprised, because he did not expect to see such a beautiful image. Irene looked at him and said with a smile that she had just finished all the preparations. Noel gazed at the young lady. She was confused and asked what was wrong. Because I didn't expect such a reaction. Noel sheepishly said that everything was fine and they should hurry. Louisa looked intently at the young people. Noel looked at the maid and said that she should stay here. Noel said that in their absence assassins could sneak in here. He also said that she need not worry about Irene, since he will always be there. The maid looked at Noel and said that he was right. She looked at Irene and said that she would guard her chambers. Irene thanked her. Irene knew that everything would happen soon. She didn't know what to do, because she couldn't calm down. She knew that this technique was very important. Therefore, she could not make a mistake. Noel looked at the young lady and asked if she was worried. Irene said in a trembling voice that she was very worried. Noel looked at her and said that he was also worried. Irene looked at him in surprise and said that she would never have thought of it. Noel smiled and said that he was a little worried too, but tried not to show it. Irene was surprised, as it seemed to her that he was completely calm. She now felt confident because of Noel's words. They left and entered the hall where the reception was taking place. Everyone was surprised. Irene and Noel calmly descended into the hall. But Elle embarrassedly told Irene that she was charming. Irene smiled and said he was also charming. Noel looked at his companion and asked why they shouldn't visit the greenhouse after the reception, as he wanted to have a cup of tea with her. Irene smiled and said that she would be happy to have tea with him. The Archduke looked intently at the young people. Noel was a little puzzled as it was too quiet. Even the music had stopped. He thought it was most likely because they had just arrived. Behind the backs of the young people, everyone was whispering furiously. They said that the young people were very beautiful, and many were speechless because of their beauty. The man was a little puzzled as he saw Irene. The Archduke looked at them and told them to continue playing the music. Noel looked at his companion and asked if she would refuse him to dance. Irene smiled and said that she would be happy to dance with him. The young people gradually began to dance. Irene remembered her mother's words that she was a terrible dancer. Her mother told her to hide somewhere in a corner so that no one would notice her. Irene looked at her feet because she knew she couldn't make a mistake. Noel came closer to Irene and told her to look only at him and not look at the floor. Irene said she was very afraid that she might step on his foot. Noel said that everything was fine. She just didn't need to show it. He looked at her and told her that she could rely on him, and he also told her not to take her eyes off him. Everyone was whispering furiously, because they saw that young people looked simply excellent together. Irene did step on Noel's foot, and in a trembling voice, she asked for his forgiveness and said that she was not very skilled at dancing. Noel smiled and said she had nothing to worry about. He told her that no one even looks at them. Irene looked around and noticed that the guests really hadn't noticed anything, and it was all thanks to Noel. She knew that once the dance was over, it was time to greet the Archduke. Noel greeted the men and apologized for being late. The Archduke said that there was nothing wrong, and he also said that he saw them dance and it was wonderful. All the guests were surprised, as they did not expect such words from the Archduke. Everyone knew that there were rumors that the Archduke and Noel were on bad terms, but it turned out that this was not the case. Irene was surprised because she saw the picture. The paintings that decorated the walls at banquets were carefully selected. They must correspond to the theme of the event and create an atmosphere, while the artist's reputation must be impeccable. However, the work that was right in front of her was different from everyone else. The Archduke said that he liked her gift, so he decided to hang it here. He looked at her and asked what she thought about this. Irene was a little puzzled, as she felt everyone's eyes on her. Aristocrats often think and say completely different things, so they couldn't help but notice. Irene knew she needed to collect her thoughts. She smiled and bowed to him. Having said that this is a great honor for her, the Archduke in turn thanked her for such a wonderful gift. Everyone present was shocked. The Archduke said he also wanted to thank everyone who came to the anniversary banquet. He looked at them and asked them to rest and enjoy tonight. Noel took Irene's hand. She was a little surprised. Noel looked at her and said that he had no desire to be among all this crowd. He said that, besides, Tom would be coming soon, and so he asked her, why don't they go to the terrace for now? Irene was very happy with his proposal and said that she did not mind. They went out onto the terrace. Irene was very happy because she was able to breathe in fresh air. She was happy because she could feel a pleasant breeze. Noel looked at the young lady and called her. She looked at him in surprise and embarrassment. He came closer to her. Irene pulled back a little. Noel looked at her and asked her not to move. She thought he wanted to kiss her. He looked at her and said that her ribbon was untied and he would send it now. She was shocked and very embarrassed because she was thinking about something else. He looked at her and asked if she was cold or not, because I saw that her face changed color. Irene sheepishly said that she was not hot, on the contrary. Noel looked at her intently. Tom came up to them and smiled since he could not find them. He looked at them and asked what was happening. The young people looked at the young man in surprise. Noel looked away embarrassedly and said that nothing was happening, and also asked if everything was ready. Tom said that everything was ready, and the knights took their positions and all the important people were assembled. Ascardo was there. He said that he was not among those present. He thought that most likely the young man was up to something. Noel told Tom not to let Ascardo out, even if he shows up. Noel looked at his companion and said that they had to go. He gave her his hand. Noel knew that she would most likely pull away. He knew that they didn't have to hold hands. They just had to go out into the hall together. But he was a little worried because he was afraid that she might refuse him. Noel was shocked, as he couldn't believe that something like this was bothering him. Irene took his hand. Noel was surprised. Irene looked at him and said they had to go. Noel looked at her confused and said that she was right. The young people, holding hands, entered the room where the party was taking place. Noel bowed and said that he would like to make a small announcement. The Archduke looked at His Majesty and asked what he thought about it. His Majesty looked at Noel and said that he did not mind. The Crown Prince loved new experiences. He would not miss anything that would attract his attention, and only retreat when he satisfied his curiosity if it was something inhuman. His Majesty will not dare to miss such an opportunity. His Majesty looked at Noel and said that everything was fine, and he was also curious about what he was going to say. One of the men present looked at His Majesty and said that today was a very significant day. He did not understand what personal announcements were for. The Archduke looked intently at the man and asked whether he had decided to disobey His Majesty's orders. The man was puzzled as he saw the Archduke's menacing and serious gaze. His Majesty looked at Noel and said that he gave the right to make an announcement. Noel bowed obediently and thanked him for the opportunity. Irene knew that Noel was worried. She was also shaking a little. She knew this was an important moment for Noel. Irene looked at Noel and said that everything was fine. She quietly said that they had gone through a lot, and for this, he would succeed. Noel was surprised and also grateful for her support. Noel looked at everyone present and said that he was taking advantage of the opportunity. He would like to announce that he and Irene Chase are getting married. Before the wedding announcement, Irene looked around at everyone present. She saw her parents and realized that they had come after all. She looked at them intently and knew that she would not want to cross paths with them. She knew that they clearly thought that she would now come down to them and greet them. However, she knew that this would not happen. She knew that she now knew what it meant to be loved. Irene turned away because she didn't want to look at them. Among all those present, she saw Count Escardo, who was Noel's brother. She knew something was wrong. She saw his pendant and was surprised because something strange was coming from it. Irene realized that the other guests did not notice anything. She wondered if Noel could see. She saw smoke that was spreading very quickly. Escardo looked at her and whispered quietly that it was too late. Irene was at a loss. She did not understand what his words meant. She saw the smoke around them and didn't understand what he was up to. The young man was very angry. He did not understand why the smoke was returning. Noel announced his marriage. Escardo walked away because he felt bad. The young man decided to leave the hall immediately. Irene was surprised and did not understand what was happening. Noel looked at her and said with a smile that the reception had come to an end. He asked her, "Why don't they be alone?" Irene looked at Noel, puzzled, and said she didn't mind. She didn't understand what had happened, and she didn't understand who the voice that sounded in her head belonged to. She smiled and said that she didn't mind going with him.